The moment Harlan Voss decided to ruin a woman's life, he did it the way he did everything, with a smile on his face and a glass of bourbon in his hand. He sat at the long table in the back room of the Red Hollow Land and Cattle Association, surrounded by the men who ran the territory like it was their personal inheritance, and he slid a folded letter across the polished wood with 2 fingers, the way you'd push away something you found stuck to the bottom of your boot. Lillian Hartwell, he said, and the name came out of his mouth like a punchline. 26 Easterner, schoolteacher's daughter, no family money, no property, no prospects. He paused to let the room settle into the joke before he finished it. And according to her own physician's records, barren. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. These were men who understood that the cruelest things didn't require noise. Send her to Raines, Voss said, folding his hands. Let him have his mail-order bride. Let the whole territory watch what happens when you put a broken woman on a broken ranch. Not one man at that table objected. Not one of them thought about what it meant to use a person as a prop in someone else's humiliation. They just signed the paperwork, sealed the arrangement, and sent the letter east to a woman who had no idea she was being offered a life as a joke. If you've ever been handed something that looked like a gift but was actually a trap, then you already know how this story begins. If you've ever been underestimated so completely that the people dismissing you didn't even bother to hide it, then you know Lillian Hartwell before you've heard a single word about her. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, because this story gets more complicated, more surprising, and far more devastating before it gets better. Hit the like button, drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. And now let's go back to the beginning. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Lillian would later think was appropriate, because nothing that changed her life had ever bothered to arrive on a day that felt significant. She was in the middle of correcting arithmetic papers when Mrs. Aldridge, the landlady, knocked twice and slid the envelope under the door without a word. That was how things worked in the boarding house on Clement Street. No ceremony, no explanation. You got your mail, and you figured out the rest yourself. Lillian set down her pen. She looked at the envelope for a moment before she opened it. The letterhead read, Western Settlement Bureau Matrimonial Correspondence Division. Below that, in careful bureaucratic print, was an offer. A rancher in the Red Hollow Territory of Wyoming was seeking a wife. The arrangement included transportation, a signed marriage certificate upon arrival, and room and board in exchange for domestic partnership. The language was formal enough to sound almost dignified, which was how Lillian knew it had been written by someone who understood that the dignity was mostly decoration. She read it twice, then she folded it and set it on her desk beside the arithmetic papers. She was 26 years old. She had $17 in a tin box under her bed, a teaching position that paid just enough to keep her from going hungry, and a letter from the physician's office that she'd been carrying around for 4 months like a stone in her coat pocket. A letter that had informed her, in clinical and bloodless language, that the illness she'd had the previous winter had likely left her unable to conceive children. She hadn't told anyone about the letter. There was no one to tell. Her mother had died when she was 15. Her father had followed 3 years later, leaving behind a small library, a set of surveying instruments, and a debt that took Lillian 2 years to pay off. She had no aunts or uncles she was close to, no suitors who'd lasted long enough to matter, and a social circle that consisted largely of other underpaid women who were too tired in the evenings to do much more than drink tea and complain about the cold. The life she had was manageable. That was the most honest word for it. She could get through a week without anything going badly wrong. She had a room with a window. She had work that sometimes felt like it meant something, on the days when a child grasped a concept they'd been struggling with and looked up with that particular expression of stunned delight. But manageable was not a future, and Lillian was clear-eyed enough to know the difference. Picked up the letter again. Wyoming Territory. A ranch. A man named Colton Raines. The Bureau's description of him was sparse in a way that told her everything it was trying not to say. A hard-working rancher of established standing, independent, private in his manner, seeking a capable and patient companion. Established standing meant the land was old, which meant either money or debt. Independent and private in his manner meant difficult. Capable and patient meant they expected the woman to do the adjusting. None of this surprised her. She'd read enough of these bureau letters. Other women at the boarding house had received them over the years to understand what they were selling and what they were leaving out. She should have put the letter away. Instead, she wrote back. The Bureau's representative, a Mr. Chadwick, met with her 2 weeks later in a downtown office that smelled of pipe tobacco and old ledgers. He was a small man in his 50s with excellent posture and the careful face of someone who had learned to seem pleasant without actually being warm. Miss Hartwell, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I understand you've expressed interest in the Raines arrangement. I have. I want to be forthright with you. He set his hands on the desk flat, like he was preparing to give bad news. Mr. Raines is not, how shall I say, a straightforward situation. The ranch is in a recovering state. The territory is remote. The winters are significant. He paused. We've had previous candidates decline once they understood the full picture. Lillian looked at him. How many previous candidates? Cleared his throat. 3. Did they decline, or did the arrangement fall through for another reason? He hesitated just long enough to be telling. They found the circumstances, not to their expectations. What are his circumstances exactly? Chadwick shifted in his chair. The ranch is currently operating at a reduced capacity. Mr. Raines experienced some difficulties some years back, a legal dispute over grazing rights that left him in an unfavorable position with the local land association. He has, as I understand it, limited social connections in the area. He is known to be, another guarded. Is he dangerous? No, nothing of that sort. He said it quickly, which meant he believed it. He is simply a solitary man who has had a difficult time of it. Bureau believes that the right partner could be of great benefit to him and to the ranch. Lillian thought about this. She thought about $17 in a tin box. She thought about the letter from the physician's office and how it had felt like a door closing somewhere in her chest, not slamming, just easing shut with a soft, final click. I'll go, she said. Chadwick looked at her, the way people sometimes looked at her when she made a decision they hadn't expected. It was a particular expression, a quick recalibration, a slight widening of the eyes. He recovered fast. Very well, he said, and began writing. She arrived in Red Hollow on a Friday afternoon in early October, 3 weeks after signing the Bureau's paperwork. The stagecoach left her at the edge of a town that was smaller than she'd imagined, and more worn than the Bureau's careful language had suggested, a main street of wooden storefronts, a feed store, a saloon with a crooked sign, a post office that shared its building with a dry goods shop. The stagecoach driver handed down her 2 bags without ceremony and climbed back up before she'd finished getting her bearings. She stood on the hard-packed road and looked at the town. And the town, in the way that small towns do, looked back. There were maybe a dozen people visible on the street. A woman sweeping a porch steps stopped sweeping. A man outside the saloon straightened up from where he'd been leaning and said something to the man beside him, low enough that Lillian couldn't hear it. But she caught the shift in attention, the way the second man turned to look at her with a slow, deliberate interest that had nothing welcoming in it. A boy of about 12 ran up to her. You the bride for Raines? I'm Miss Hartwell, she said. The boy stared at her for a moment, like she was something strange and possibly threatening. Then he turned and ran back the way he'd come, and she heard him say to someone around the corner, She looks real enough, which told Lillian everything she needed to know about what Red Hollow had been expecting. She asked at the post office for directions to the Raines ranch. The woman behind the counter, 40-ish, with a face that had decided years ago not to bother with softness, gave her the directions in a flat, clipped voice and then added, as Lillian was turning to leave, You know what you're getting into? I know what I've been told. That's not the same thing. Lillian looked at her. No, she agreed, it rarely is. She walked out. The ranch was 4 miles from town, which she'd known from Chadwick's paperwork, but 4 miles with 2 bags and October wind cutting across open land was a different kind of 4 miles than the kind you read about on paper. She was tired and cold, and her left shoulder ached by the time the structure came into view, a main house, a barn, a bunkhouse that looked like it hadn't been occupied in years, and a series of fence lines that were mostly standing but wanted attention. It was not by any measure a prosperous picture, but it wasn't the disaster she'd half braced herself for either. The main house had 4 walls and a roof and firewood stacked against one side. The barn was sound. The land around it was flat and wide and dormant for the season, but good land, she could see that. Her father had been a surveyor, and he'd taught her to read land the way other fathers taught their children to read books. She set her bags down at the edge of the yard and looked at the house. The door opened before she knocked. Colton Raines was not what she'd expected, which was something she was beginning to understand about this entire situation. It almost never was what you expected. He was tall and he'd been handsome once in a rough-edged way, and the remnants of it were still visible if you looked. But mostly what she saw was a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had learned to move around it rather than put it down. He was maybe 32 or 33, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed a razor and eyes that took her in with the careful, measuring attention of someone who'd been surprised before and hadn't liked it. Stood in the doorway and looked at her. She looked back. "You're Lillian Hartwell," he said. "Yes." "You walked from town." It wasn't a question. He'd probably been watching since she came up the road. "The stagecoach doesn't come out this far," she said. He looked at her bags on the ground and then back at her. Something shifted in his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not welcome exactly, but not dismissal either. More like the recalculation of a man who'd built an expectation and found the reality didn't match it. "Come inside," he said. "I'll get the fire going." The inside of the house was sparse in a way that went beyond poverty. It was sparse the way places get when the person living in them has stopped imagining that anything new might arrive. There was a table, 2 chairs, a stove, a shelf with 6 or 7 books, a coat rack with a single jacket on it. The walls were bare. The window over the table had a curtain that might have been white once. The floor was swept clean. Colton added wood to the stove without looking at her and said, "There's a room at the back, separate from mine." "All right. I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't know what Chadwick told you. Told me the ranch is in a recovering state, that you've had legal difficulties with the land association, and that you're private in your manner." Colton turned to look at her. There was something in his expression. She recognized the faint, controlled version of anger that comes not from aggression, but from humiliation, from having your circumstances described by someone who's never had to live in them. "That what he called it?" he said flatly. "Yes, well." He turned back to the stove. "He's not wrong. The land association's been after this place for 6 years. They got my neighbor's ranch 2 years back. They're working on mine," he said it. The way you say a thing you've said too many times, flat, factual. The emotion worn smooth. The work's hard. The winters are hard. There's not much help. People in town. He stopped again. "I noticed them," Lillian said. He glanced at her sideways, and she saw something flicker in his face. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it, brief and reluctant. "Yeah," he said, "I expect you did." She looked around the kitchen. There was a pot on the stove, and the smell of something that had been cooking for a while, beans, salt pork maybe. On the shelf next to the books, there was a small tin of coffee that was probably running low. "Tell you something," she said. He waited. "I have a physician's letter. I received it some months ago. It says—" She kept her voice even, because she'd been practicing keeping it even for 4 months. "It says I'm likely unable to have children. I don't know if the Bureau told you." The silence after this was different from the silences that had come before it. He turned fully to face her, and she couldn't tell what was happening in his expression, because he was one of those men who'd learned to keep his face somewhere between neutral and closed. But he was looking at her with a kind of attention that felt she wasn't sure. Direct, unsettling in a way that wasn't threatening. "They didn't tell me," he said. "I expected they hadn't." "Does it—" He seemed to be choosing his words carefully, which she suspected wasn't his usual way of operating. "Does it matter to you?" "Yes," she said simply. "It matters. But it's what's true. I thought you should know." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, slow, and turned back to the stove. "Supper's almost ready," he said. "Room's at the back. You can get settled." She picked up her bags and found the room. The first week was not warm. That would be the most accurate word for it, not cold in any deliberate way, but not warm. They existed in the same spaces without quite occupying them together. He rose before she did, was already outside by the time she came to the kitchen. She made coffee and put it on the stove for when he came back in. He didn't thank her for it, the first morning or the second, but on the third, he poured himself a cup and stood by the window drinking it and said, without turning around, "Good coffee." Took that for what it was. She spent those first days learning the house. It wasn't difficult to see what needed doing. Everything needed doing, the way things do when there's been only one person managing them for years, and that person's attention has been focused primarily on survival. The window latches needed tightening. 2 of the stove's feet had cracked, and the whole unit sat slightly unlevel, which meant the heat wasn't distributing properly. The root cellar beneath the kitchen trapdoor held a reasonable stock of preserved food, but it was organized by someone who'd been throwing things in rather than thinking about access. She fixed the stove feet with a piece of scrap iron she found in the barn. She reorganized the root cellar. She took the curtains down and washed them in the basin outside, which was cold enough work that her hands went numb before she was finished, and rehung them while they were still slightly damp, so they'd dry without wrinkling too badly. Colton noticed all of it. She could tell by the way his eyes moved around the kitchen in the mornings, landing on things she'd changed, not saying anything, but registering. On the 5th day, he came in from the barn at mid-morning instead of afternoon, and stood at the kitchen door with a look on his face like he was working up to something. "You don't have to do all that," he said. "I know. I'm not expecting," he stopped. "Try it again. This arrangement. I don't expect you to work yourself like a hand." Lillian looked up from the pot she was stirring. "I'm not working like anything," she said. "I'm just doing what needs doing. What I'm used to." He studied her. "What did you do before?" "Taught school. And before that, helped my father with his surveying business. I read land figures, kept the books, sometimes went out with him when he needed a second pair of hands on a measurement." Something changed in his expression. "Your father was a surveyor. You know how to read a survey maps." The silence that followed had a different quality from the other silences. It was the silence of a man rearranging his understanding of a situation. "I have maps," he said finally, "of this land. The association's been contesting the boundary lines on the eastern section. I've been fighting them in the county recorder's office for 2 years, but I'd only stopped. I'm not a reading man. Not for legal documents." "Show me," she said. He brought the maps. They spread them on the kitchen table that evening, and Lillian looked at them the way her father had taught her, not just the lines themselves, but the notation systems, the reference points, the dates on the survey marks, the way the measurements linked to the physical features of the land. It took her an hour to work through the first set, and another 40 minutes to understand what she was looking at. "These marks here," she said, pointing to a series of notation in the eastern corner. "This survey was conducted in 1871. But look at this one." She slid the second map over and laid it adjacent to the first. "This is the association's version of the same survey. Different reference point. They've shifted the benchmark almost 40 feet. Colton leaned over the table. "Is that legal?" "No. The original benchmark can be proven. Their version is fraudulent." She traced the reference lines with her finger. "The original survey should have a physical marker. Post, a marked rock, something. Do you know the eastern boundary well? I've ridden it 100 times. Could you find a survey post from 1871 if we went looking?" He looked at the map for a long time. Then he looked at her. "Maybe," he said, and it was the most careful word she'd heard him use yet. Not yes, not no, but maybe, which meant he was thinking it was possible and didn't want to say so until he was sure. "Then that's where we start," she said. 2 weeks into her time on the ranch, a woman from town rode out on a Tuesday. Her name was Mrs. Pruitt. Colton said it with a flatness that told Lillian everything about what kind of visit this would be. She was a wide-boned woman in her late 50s, with the particular manner of someone who considered herself a source of useful information and acted accordingly. She sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Lillian offered her and looked around the house with eyes that were cataloging everything, storing it away for later distribution. "You've made some changes," she said. "A few things needed attention." She turned her eyes to Lillian. "You seem capable enough. I'll grant you that." It was said in a tone that made the grant feel like a grudging concession against better judgment. Red Hall wasn't sure what to expect, if I'm honest. What were they expecting? Mrs. Pruitt folded her hands around her cup. "A woman who wouldn't last the month. If I'm being honest." Lillian looked at her steadily. "You're being honest. What I do." She didn't seem embarrassed by it. "Raines is not an easy man. The ranch is not an easy situation. 3 women before you turned around within days. Town figured you'd do the same." She paused. "Some of them are a little put out that you haven't. Put out. There were some bets made." She said it without particular apology. "The way small towns do." Lillian set her coffee down. "How much did they bet against me lasting the month?" Mrs. Pruitt's mouth did something that was almost a smile, enough that a few of them are going to feel it. After she left, Lillian stood at the window for a while. She wasn't angry, exactly. She'd known, from the moment she stepped off the stagecoach, and the boy asked if she was the bride for Raines, that this was how they saw her. The joke, the charity case, the woman foolish enough to come. There was something in being told it plainly that was almost clarifying. It took away any remaining uncertainty about what she was dealing with. She went back to the kitchen and started on the bread. The problem with the eastern boundary line was, as Lillian suspected, only one part of a larger and more deliberate assault. Colton told her about it in pieces, the way a person tells you things they've been carrying alone for so long that they've forgotten how to say them all at once. A little at the table over supper. A little walking the fence line in the early morning when the light was flat and cold, and conversation somehow came easier in it. Harlan Voss owned the Red Hollow Land and Cattle Association. He'd built it over 15 years by doing two things, simultaneously acquiring land through legitimate purchase when he could get it, and acquiring land through manufactured legal disputes when he couldn't. He was not a man who was ever obviously wrong. He was a man who was always just barely, technically correct. The paperwork was always slightly off. The survey was always slightly disputed. The boundary was always just unclear enough to argue about. He'd gotten 4 ranches in the territory this way. Colton's father had been one of the men he'd gone after 12 years earlier. Father had died still fighting the case, and the legal debt had consumed most of what the ranch was worth. Colton had come back at 21 and taken up the fight with nothing but the land itself and a stubbornness that the people of Red Hollow might have admired under other circumstances. "He sent someone out the week after you arrived," Colton said one evening. They were at the table with the maps again. A new one this time. Lillian had written to the county recorder's office using her father's name and methodology and gotten back a copy of the original 1871 survey. Voss's man name's Decker. He works for the association. What did he want? Said the association was reconsidering their position on the eastern boundary. Offered to drop the dispute. He looked at the map, not at her. For 40% of the grazing rights. You said no. I said no. His jaw was set. They've done this with every ranch they've taken. They come back with an offer that sounds like compromise, and it's not. It's just the first payment on something that never ends. Lillian looked at the original survey in her hand. The benchmark reference was clear, a stone marker at the junction of 2 creek beds, placed and logged in 1871 by a surveyor named James Holt. The association's version moved the line 40 feet east, which placed a significant portion of Colton's grazing land inside what they were claiming as association territory. If we find the stone marker, she said, and if it's intact, the original survey holds. Their claim falls, I know. He rubbed the back of his neck. I've looked for it before, spent 3 days out there last spring. Didn't find it. You were looking for a wooden post. What? The association's challenged documents, I read through them last night. When they contest the benchmark, they describe a wooden post. But Holt's notation here, she tapped the original survey. He set a stone marker, quarry stone, 12 inches square. Wouldn't rot, wouldn't move. It's there. You just didn't know what you were looking for. Colton stared at the notation for a long moment. 12 inches square, he said slowly. Quarry stone, in a creek junction. The creek may have shifted since 1871, but the stone wouldn't have moved far, if at all. He looked up at her. In the low light of the kitchen, with the fire going, and the map spread between them, there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite label. Not gratitude, it was too complicated for gratitude. More like the look of a man who'd been handed something he'd stopped expecting to receive. Tomorrow morning, he said, we go look. They found the marker on the second day. It was not a dramatic discovery. Lillian wouldn't remember it as a dramatic discovery. She'd remember it as cold and muddy, and her boots going wrong into the soft ground by the creek bank, and Colton on his hands and knees in the November mud, and then a sound his voice low and certain here. The stone was there, 12 inches square, set deep and solid, exactly where Holt's notation said it would be. The association's claimed boundary line ran 42 feet east of it. The original line, Colton's line, was clear. He didn't say anything for a while. Just crouched there in the mud with his hand on the stone marker. Lillian didn't say anything either. She'd learned, over these weeks, that he didn't do well with sentiment, not because he didn't feel things, but because he'd been alone long enough that emotional expression had become unfamiliar in a way that made him reach for it awkwardly and then pull back from it. So she just stood beside him and let him have the moment. After a while, he stood up. He was covered in mud from the knees down, and there were creek-bottom stains on his jacket sleeves. I need a witness, he said. Someone from town who's not connected to the association. Old man Drury at the post office, Lillian said. He's not affiliated. He's been postmaster for 30 years. A county court would take his attestation. Colton looked at her. How do you know that about Drury? I asked. When I first got here. I asked everyone who wasn't obviously affiliated with the association what they thought of the county's legal mechanisms. She paused. What my father would have done. He held her gaze. Cold was sharp, and the light was going flat in the way it did out here at the end of an autumn afternoon, and somewhere on the property a fence post was loose and banging in the wind. He said, "Yes, why did you come here?" It was the first time he'd asked. She'd wondered when he would. She thought about the honest answer for a moment. Not the practiced version, the real one. "Because the life I had was survivable," she said. "And I wanted something more than survivable." He stood with that for a moment. Then he nodded. Once the same slow nod he'd given her when she told him about the physician's letter. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They walked back to the ranch in the cold, the stone marker behind them in the mud, the boundary line finally, definitively, proven. It should have been the end of the trouble. It was not the end of the trouble. First threat came 3 days after they went to Drury. It wasn't Decker this time. It was a man Lillian hadn't seen before lean, with the careful-eyed look of a man who worked at staying unimportant, who arrived at the ranch on a gray morning when Colton was in the barn and knocked on the kitchen door, like he was just a traveler looking for water. "Mrs. Raines," he said. He said it like a test watching to see how she'd react to the name. "Can I help you?" He looked past her into the kitchen. "Nice place," he said. "Cozier than it used to be, I'm told. What do you want?" He smiled. It was the kind of smile that was designed to look friendly and succeeded only in looking practiced. "Mr. Voss would like you to know that he's aware of the survey research you've been doing. He finds it impressive. He wanted to relay his personal admiration. His personal admiration. He's a man who respects ambition." The smile stayed exactly where it was. He also wanted to relay that Red Hollow is a small territory. People rely on the association for a great many things. Grazing rights, water access, credit at the land office. He paused. It would be unfortunate if certain arrangements were complicated. "Is that a threat?" "It's a courtesy." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Raines." She stood at the door until he was out of sight. Then she went and found Colton. He listened to her account without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, very carefully, "Did he frighten you?" "Not particularly." He looked at her. "I'm not a woman who frightens easily," she said. "But I think you should know they're watching us closely enough to know what we've been doing at the recorder's office. Voss has people everywhere." His voice was flat, he always has. "Then we need to be faster than we have been." She went back to the table and the maps. "Drury has agreed to witness. We need to get the attestation to the county court before Voss has time to file a counter-challenge. How long would it take you to get to Laramie?" 3 days. Maybe 2.5 hard riding. "Could you go this week?" He looked at her for a moment. "You'd be here alone." "Yes, that's what they'd want." I know what they'd want," she said evenly. "I also know that the longer we wait, the more time Voss has to manufacture another reason to delay the filing. Stone marker is documented. Drury has signed his attestation. If we don't move now, I know." His jaw was tight. "I know." Silence between them, the fire crackled. "I'll be all right," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she admitted. "But I'm asking you to trust that I can handle 3 days." He looked at her for a long time. The look that she couldn't quite read, the complicated one. Not admiration exactly, but something close to its difficult cousin. "Lock the doors at night," he said. "The Winchester's on the shelf in the back room. You know how to use it?" "My father taught me." "Of course he did." He stood up and reached for his coat. "I'll leave before first light." The 3 days he was gone were the longest 3 days of Lillian's time on the ranch, and not because anything terrible happened, because nothing happened. The silence was total. The man from Voss did not come back. No one came from town. She did the morning chores, worked the fence line on the south side that she'd been meaning to get to for weeks, ate alone at the kitchen table, read by the fire at night with the Winchester on the bench beside her. She was not afraid, exactly, but she was aware of being alone in a way she hadn't been in weeks, and the awareness of it was its own kind of weight. On the second night, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, long past dark, with a cup of cold coffee, and the original survey spread out in front of her, thinking about what Colton had said. "Me too." 2 words, and then he'd walked away from them. Back to the practical problem, the way he always walked back to the practical problem. She thought about what it meant to survive something long enough that survival itself became the whole definition of your life. She'd seen it in herself, the year after the physician's letter, when she'd gotten very good at not thinking about the future, because the future had a shape that hurt to look at directly. You got through the week. You marked the arithmetic papers. You put the $17 in the tin box. She thought maybe that was what had happened to him, too. Years of fighting something unwinnable had narrowed his whole life down to the fighting. He'd forgotten there was supposed to be something else on the other side of it. She put the survey away and went to bed. Colton came back on the evening of the third day, just as the light was failing. She heard the horse and went to the door, and he came in looking like he'd ridden hard and slept in a barn, which she suspected was exactly what had happened. "Filed," he said. He set his hat on the rack and sat down heavily in the chair. "County recorders got the attestation. The judge assigned to land disputes is a man named Ferris. He doesn't take association money." He said it like the absence of a corruption was an extraordinary thing, which out here, she was beginning to understand, sometimes it was. Voss can challenge it, but it'll have to go to actual court. "That's not nothing. That's a great deal, more than nothing," she said, and set a plate in front of him. He ate in silence for a while. She sat across from him with her coffee and didn't try to fill the silence, which was something she'd learned. He needed not the filling of silences, but the comfortable presence in them. "Town knows," he said. "Voss's man Decker was in the saloon last night when I passed through. Made a point of saying it loud enough. Something about the Raines woman, thinking she's a lawyer. Got a laugh. I imagine he did. Doesn't bother you?" "It bothered me," she said carefully. "And then I decided it was more useful as information than as an insult." He looked up from the plate. "What kind of information?" "That Voss is uncomfortable. Men who aren't worried don't bother to mock the people worrying them. He knows the survey documentation is solid. He's trying to turn the town against us before it gets to court." Colton put the fork down. He looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her, that measuring look, that recalibration. "Lillian," he said, "yes. Where did you learn to think like that?" "My father," she said. "He used to say when the other man starts making noise, it's because you've got something he can't legally take from you." For a moment something moved across Colton's face. Not the controlled, careful expression he usually maintained, something more unguarded than that. Something that was almost the beginning of a smile. "Smart man," he said he was. She picked up her cup. "Get some sleep. We've got the south fence to finish tomorrow, and the weather's turning." He nodded and stood and took his plate to the basin. And that night, for the first time since she'd arrived, Lillian slept without the Winchester on the bench beside her. It wasn't that the trouble was over. It wasn't even that she was certain it would be all right. It was just that she no longer felt entirely alone in it. She would think about that feeling later, in the months that came after the strange, fragile, impractical thing that had begun to grow in the drafty kitchen of that struggling ranch, between a woman who'd been sent as a joke and a man who'd spent years, forgetting he was allowed to want a different kind of life. She would think about how quickly it could be threatened, how little it took for the world to decide that something hopeful was a target. She didn't know yet, sitting in the kitchen on that November evening, what was coming. She didn't know about the conversation Harlan Voss had that same night in the back room of the Red Hollow Land and Cattle Association, where he sat across from Decker and said, the tone of a man adjusting his strategy, "We're done being subtle." She didn't know what that meant yet. She would. Decker's warning had not been idle. Lillian understood that now. The week after Colton returned from Laramie, the association's men started showing up in ways that were too regular to be accidental. A rider on the ridge above the eastern pasture, sitting still for an hour and then gone. Tracks in the mud near the barn that weren't Colton's boot size. Cattle that had been grazing the south section moved 2 miles overnight, which could have been a predator, except predators left signs, and this left nothing but the absence of the herd and a cut wire on the fence she'd spent 2 days fixing. Colton found the wire on a Thursday morning and stood looking at it for a long time without speaking. Lillian stood beside him, and the wind moved through the dry grass, and neither of them said what was obvious. "They're escalating," she said finally. "Yeah." He crouched down and touched the cut end. Clean, not a break, a cut. Deliberate. This is Decker. He's done this before on the Hendricks place, 2 years before they took it. Small damage first, then bigger. The idea is you spend so much time repairing what they destroy that you don't have time to do anything else. Attrition. That's a polished word for it. It's what it is. She looked across the pasture. Cattle were visible, now distant, having found their own way to the creek. "We can't afford to be on defense. Every day we're fixing wire. We're not building anything." He stood up. His jaw was tight. "I know. The court filing, when does Ferris typically rule on preliminary challenges? Months. Maybe spring if we're not delayed. Voss knows that. He's going to make the next 4 or 5 months as difficult as he can." She turned to look at him directly. "We need people." "What people?" People in town who aren't afraid of the association. People who know what he's doing and would testify to it if it came to court. She paused. You said he did the same thing to the Hendricks place. Are those people still in the territory? Something shifted in Colton's expression. Walt Hendricks moved his family to Cheyenne after they lost the land. But his brother Cal is still here, works the feed mill. Does Cal know what happened to his brother's ranch? He was there for all of it. His voice was careful. But he and we've never been close. The Hendricks family blamed themselves for losing the land. It's not a thing Cal talks about. He might talk about it if someone asked the right way. You think you can ask the right way? It wasn't a question. Exactly. But it wasn't sarcasm either. He was asking her to tell him honestly whether she could do this, because he'd her over the past weeks and had come to understand that she didn't overstate her abilities. I think I'm a woman from the East who has no history in this town and no reason to be associated with any existing grudges, she said. Which means Cal Hendricks doesn't have a reason to shut down before he starts. Yes, I think I can ask the right way. Colton looked at her for another moment. Then he bent down and picked up the cut wire. Go on Tuesday, he said. Market day. Town's busier. You'll blend in better. She went on Tuesday. The feed mill was at the north end of the main street, set slightly back from the road, with the smell of grain dust and axle grease that she could identify before she reached the door. Cal Hendricks was behind the counter. She knew him immediately because he had the same flat, guarded look that half the men in Red Hollow had, the look of people who'd been watching the territory tighten around them for years and had learned that hope was something you kept close and didn't show in public. He was maybe 50, with forearms like fence posts, and the kind of deliberate slowness that wasn't laziness, but the economy of motion of a man who'd done hard physical work his whole life. Mrs. Raines, he said when she'd introduced herself. He said it the way Mrs. Pruitt had said it testing. But there was less hostility in it than she'd expected. More wariness. I wanted to ask you about your brother's ranch, she said. She'd decided on the direct approach because she'd learned that men like Cal Hendricks responded better to directness than to anything that smelled like maneuvering. Quiet for a moment. That's a subject people around here generally leave alone. I know, I'm not from around here. She kept her voice level. Voss's men cut our fence wire last week. We lost a section of the south herd. Before that, they had a rider watching the eastern pasture for 3 days. I know what he's doing. My husband knows what he's doing. But knowing and being able to stop it are different things. Cal looked at the counter. He moved a bag of oats 6 inches to the left, and then back again, the way a person moves things when they're thinking and their hands need something to do. Walt tried to fight it. He said yes. He had documentation, too. Land survey, proper filing, the whole thing. His voice was flat, even. The flatness of something a long time past anger. The association filed 17 counter-challenges over 2 years. By the time the court got around to a real hearing, Walt didn't have the money left to put a lawyer in front of the judge. The ranch went for back taxes. He looked up. That's how Voss does it. He doesn't win. He exhausts you until you can't keep going. I know, Lillian said. That's why I'm here. Because the money is going to be a problem for us too, eventually, and I'm trying to find a way around it before it becomes the whole problem. What way? Multiple plaintiffs. If there are other people in the territory who have documented damages from Voss's tactics, other ranchers, other businesses, even just witnesses who saw what he did to the Hendricks land, a group case in front of Ferris is harder to delay and harder to bury with counter-filings. Cal Hendricks looked at her for a long time. Long enough that the silence grew uncomfortable and then passed through uncomfortable into something more serious. Walt's been gone for 2 years, he said. He's not coming back to testify. You were there, I was there. And you remember what happened. Every day. The words came out quiet, not emotional quieter than emotion, which was its own kind of weight. Would you be willing to put it in writing? A formal affidavit, attested before a notary. It wouldn't require you to appear in court unless the case advanced. It would just be documentation. He moved the oat bag again, set it back, looked at her. My wife's brother works for the association, he said. Not Voss directly, but the Water Rights Division. If it got out that I filed papers against them, I understand. Do you? Yes. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to take a risk I wouldn't take myself. I'm asking whether you'd be willing to if there was a way to do it that minimized the exposure. I'm not going to pretend there's no risk. I'm just telling you that what Voss is doing to our land, he will do to every independent rancher in this territory unless someone stops him. And right now, we're the ones who have standing to try. The grain dust moved in the light from the high windows. A wagon went past outside, and its wheels on the hardpack road made a sound like distant thunder. "Let me talk to my wife," Cal said. "That's all I'm asking." She left before he could change his mind. Cold came in hard the second week of November, the kind of cold that arrived in the territory without the gradual preparation of a normal autumn, but as a flat announcement that the season had ended and winter had arrived, and it wasn't going to apologize for the timing. Colton and Lillian spent 3 days bringing everything inside that needed to be inside, patching the barn roof where there were gaps that last year's snow had found, reinforcing the storage of the feedstock, checking the water pipes. It was work that was entirely physical and entirely necessary and left little room for anything else, which was maybe why the conversation they'd been mostly not having finally happened on the third evening when they were both too tired to maintain whatever careful distance they'd been maintaining. She'd been trying to get the kitchen stovepipe fitting to stop leaking cold air and had been crouched on the table for 20 minutes with a wrench and a rag and not quite enough reach to do the job properly. He'd come in from the barn, taken one look at her precarious situation, and without asking said move over and taken the wrench from her hand and done it in 40 seconds. "I had it," she said. "You had a strained back coming," he said, stepping down from the table. He handed her the wrench. There was a smear of pipe grease on his jaw that he hadn't noticed. "You have," she gestured at her own jaw. He rubbed the wrong side. "Other side." He rubbed again, missed again. She took the rag off the table, and, before she'd thought about whether this was the kind of thing she should do, reached up and wiped the grease off herself. He went very still. Not the stillness of alarm, the stillness of someone who hadn't been touched in a long time and didn't know what to do with the fact of it. "Step back." "Sorry, don't be." His voice was low. He looked at the rag, not at her. "I'm not good at this." "Good at what?" "Any of it." He set the wrench on the shelf, stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was deciding whether to say something or let it go. "People, being around people. I've been on my own out here so long I don't." He turned around. "You were supposed to be something to mock. That's what the town expected. And instead you come here and you know how to read a survey, and you fix the stove feet, and you go talk to Cal Hendricks without me having to ask you to, and I don't know what to." He stopped. "I'm not explaining this well." "You're doing fine," she said. "I'm not." His jaw was tight, but not with anger. With the effort of saying something he didn't have words for. "I don't want you to think I don't notice what you're doing here, that I take it for granted." Lillian looked at him steadily. He was terrible at this, in the specific way of a man who'd spent a decade without anyone to practice it with, and that made it more honest than something polished would have been. "Colton," she said, "I didn't come here for gratitude." "I know, that's not—" "Never mind." "What?" A long pause. The fire settled. The cold pressed against the window. "I thought you'd leave," he said, after the first week. "I thought everyone leaves. There's no reason to stay. And you just—" he shook his head. "You fixed the stove feet." She almost smiled. Somebody had to. He looked at her. And for a moment the careful, guarded expression he wore most of the time slipped far enough that she could see what was underneath it. Not something soft, exactly, but something real, raw in the way of things that don't get much air. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever happens with Voss, with the land, I'm glad you came." She held that for a moment. "I am too," she said. It wasn't the whole truth of what she was starting to feel, and she suspected he knew that, and she suspected he was feeling something similar, and also not saying the whole of it, and they both understood, without saying anything about it, that this was as far as either of them was ready to go tonight. "I'll make coffee," she said. "I'll get the last of the barn checks done," he said, and reached for his coat, and she watched him go and put the kettle on and stood at the stove with the warmth of it against her hands and thought about being somewhere she'd chosen, actually chosen. Cal Hendricks came to the ranch on a Saturday unannounced, which told her he'd made his decision and hadn't wanted time to reconsider it. He brought his wife Clara, a quiet woman who looked at everything with sharp attention and said very little, which Lillian recognized as a different kind of intelligence from the loud kind. Colton made coffee. Clara took a cup without ceremony and settled into the chair by the window and listened while Cal talked. Talked for almost 2 hours. The detail in what he knew was startling, not because she doubted him, but because she hadn't fully anticipated how thoroughly a man could catalog the destruction of something he loved. He remembered dates, he remembered specific filings and the names of the association's lawyers, the precise language of counter-challenges that had been designed not to win, but to delay. He remembered conversations Voss's men had had in public, thinly veiled enough to constitute intimidation, but carefully phrased to avoid it. He remembered the day Walt had finally told him he was done fighting, and the way his brother's face had looked, which Cal's described in a tone so flat, it was clear he'd spent 2 years trying to feel nothing about it and had not entirely succeeded. Colton sat across the table and listened, and Lillian watched his face and saw the things she'd seen in it before, that controlled stillness that was him. Managing the fact that someone else's story was also his story had always been his story, but told from a vantage point he'd never had access to. When Cal was done, there was a silence that felt necessary. "I'll write the affidavit," Cal said. "Clara's brother, we talked to him. He's not he doesn't love the association. He took the work because it was work. He's not going to raise a fuss." He looked at Colton. "You're not going to win this with one document. You know that." "I know. You're going to need money for the long fight. County court is a start, but if Voss appeals and he will, it goes to Laramie. Expensive." "I know." Colton's voice was quiet. "I don't have it figured out." "There are 2 other ranchers," Cal said. "Tom Bauer on the western boundary and the Reyes family north of town. Voss has been working them both, the same way he worked Walt. Same slow pressure. They're not at the crisis point yet, but they're watching you." He looked at Lillian, not at Colton. "They're watching what happens to you. Then we need to not lose," Lillian said. Clara from the window made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. Practical woman," she said. It was the first thing she'd said in 2 hours, and it landed like a compliment. After they left, Colton sat at the table for a long time with his hands folded and the remains of the coffee going cold. "Tom Bauer hasn't spoken to me in 4 years," he said. "We had a dispute over water access. Nothing serious in the scheme of things, but he holds things. Would he hold a grudge against Voss more than he holds one against you? Probably. Then someone needs to ask him." He looked at her. "You going to handle that one too?" "I think that one should be you," she said. "Man to man, neighbor to neighbor. He needs to hear it from you directly." Something moved in his expression, not reluctance, more like the awareness of something uncomfortable that was nevertheless right. "Yeah," he said. "It doesn't have to be elegant," she said. "It just has to be honest." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "You know what's strange?" he said. "What?" "You've been here less than 2 months, and you understand this place better than people who've been here their whole lives. My father taught me how to read a situation, the same way he taught me to read a survey map," she said. "You look for the fixed points and work out from there." "What are the fixed points here?" She thought about it. "Voss wants the land because it's worth more than he's paying for it. The people in town are afraid of him, but they don't love him. Cal is willing to talk if someone makes it feel possible. You have the legal documentation." And she paused. "And you've been fighting alone for a long time, and you're better at it than you think you are, but not as good with someone beside you." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That last one might be right." Colton rode to the Bauer Ranch on a Tuesday and came back on Wednesday evening looking like the conversation had gone exactly as awkward as he'd expected, and something had come out of it anyway. He came in, sat down, accepted the plate she put in front of him, and after the first few bites said, "Bauer's in. He's got his own survey irregularities. Different parcel, same tactic. Good." He stopped, ate another bite. He said he was sorry about how the town treated you when you first arrived. Lillian looked up. Tom Bauer said that in his way, which is not a particularly graceful way, but he said it. He didn't look up from the plate. He said the whole thing with the bets was Decker's idea, and most people went along because they were afraid not to. He said you didn't deserve it." She was quiet for a moment. She hadn't realized until he said it how much she'd needed to hear it, which was an uncomfortable thing to realize. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "Maybe not. But it matters that he said it." He looked up then, briefly. "It matters to me." She looked at him, and there it was again, that thing between them that neither of them had fully named, that lived in the silences and the brief, unguarded moments and the cold morning light when he came in from the barn and she handed him the coffee without asking. It was building into something. Both of them knew it. Neither of them had said it, because the situation was still too unstable and the habit of caution was too deeply ingrained in both of them. But it was there. The violence, when it came, arrived in the form of fire. Started in the feed barn. Lillian woke to the smell before she woke to the sounds and smoke first, then the shriek of the horses, then Colton's voice in the hallway, sharp and urgent, "Get up." Now she was out the door, before she'd fully processed what was happening. The feed barn was on the north side of the property, and the glow of it was visible from the house, not enormous yet, but moving the way fire moves in dry wood. fast and purposeful. They saved the horses first. She took 2 by the bridles while Colton got the other 3, and they drove them out into the far pasture away from the structure. Barn itself was beyond saving by the time they'd secured the animals. The fire had found the feedstock, and there was nothing to do but contain it before it jumped to the main barn. They worked side by side in the dark with wet feed sacks and dirt and sheer physical effort for an hour. Maybe more. She stopped tracking time. At some point, she became aware that her hands were burned in 2 places. Minor, not serious, but the pain was there, and she noticed it the way you notice things in emergencies. Stored away, to be dealt with later. There was ash in her hair, and her nightgown was ruined, and at one point she looked over at Colton and saw blood on the sides of his face, from where he'd caught the edge of the barn door, coming down, and she thought, clearly and precisely they did this. Not because of a survey or a boundary line, because they were getting somewhere. Because the filing in Laramie was going to hold, and Voss knew it, and this was the escalation. Decker had signaled 2 months ago. The main barn held. By 2 in the morning, the feed barn was a ruin, and the rest of the property was intact. Stood outside in the cold breathing. Lillian's hands hurt, and there was ash everywhere, and the smell of smoke was going to be in everything for days. Evidence, she said. Her voice came out rough. Colton looked at her. Don't touch anything in there until morning. The way it started the origin point, it's important. She coughed. Breathed. My father worked with the county assessor once on a property dispute that involved a fire. They can tell the difference between an accident and a start point. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ruin of the barn. There was a particular silence in him that wasn't grief, exactly. It was the silence of someone adding one more thing to the weight they'd already been carrying, adjusting for it. They want us to run, he said. Yes, are you going to run? She looked at him. Ash in her hair, burned hands, ruined nightgown, 2 in the morning in Wyoming November, with a barn smoldering behind them. No, she said. He nodded once, the same slow nod. Me neither, he said. The sheriff came out the next morning. His name was Doyle, a man, in his 60s, who had the careful non-committal demeanor of someone who'd survived in a difficult county by not committing to anything too strongly. He walked through the ruin, asked some questions, wrote some things in a notebook, and then stood at the edge of the property, looking toward the road. Can't say what caused it, he said. I can, Lillian said. He looked at her. The fire started in the northeast corner of the structure, in the feed hay storage. That section was loaded 4 days ago. I did it myself. The hay was dry, but it was not spontaneously combustible. We had no heat source in that corner. No lanterns, no lighting of any kind. She'd gone through the ruin carefully that morning, while Colton was in town. Her hands still hurt, but she'd used them anyway. The origin point shows what looks like an accelerant. The wood is charred in a pattern, consistent with something having been poured on it, not a fire that spread from a single spark. Doyle looked at the ruin. He looked at his notebook. That's a serious accusation, he said. I haven't named anyone, she said. I've described what the physical evidence shows. Quiet for a long time. Then he said carefully, the association carries a lot of weight in this county. I'm aware of that. Filing a report that points toward arson, toward parties connected to Harlan Voss, that's not something I can do without. There would need to be more evidence than a fire pattern. I know. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to do anything right now, Sheriff. I'm asking you to write down what I described in your notebook, accurately. Because if there's a next time, and I believe there will be a next time, I want it documented that we told you the truth about this one. He looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote in his notebook. It wasn't victory. It wasn't close to victory. But she'd looked the county's institutional inertia in the face and may sent write something down. And that was something. They rebuilt the feed storage from salvaged lumber, and 2 men Colton had known from the early days of the ranch who came out without being asked, which understood was the first sign of something shifting in the way the territory was watching them. Word had spread it moved through a small community the way everything moved, fast and quiet, person to person. People knew about the fire. They knew about the sheriff's visit. They were drawing their own conclusions, and some of them were drawing conclusions that were not favorable to the association. Mrs. Pruitt came by again on the Saturday after the fire. Came with a covered dish, which was not something she'd done before. She set it on the kitchen table and looked around in the way she always did, cataloging. Tom Bauer says you're building a case, she said. Tom Bauer talks too much, Colton said he does. But in this instance, she set her hands flat on the table. In this instance, he might not be wrong to be talking. There are people in this town who have something to say about Harlan Voss. People who've been saying nothing for years because there was nothing useful to say it to. She looked at Lillian. There becomes something useful to say it to a lawyer, a court, a group filing some of those people might speak. Lillian looked at her for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Mrs. Pruitt's expression shifted slightly, not into softness exactly, but into something more honest than her usual manner. "Because I was one of the people who laughed when you arrived," she said. It was said without particular self-flagellation, just plainly. "I thought you'd be gone in a week. I was wrong, and I know when I'm wrong." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "There are 4 families I know of who have documents they never thought were worth anything. I'll mention that someone might want to look at them." She left. Colton looked at the covered dish. "What is that?" "I think it's a casserole," Lillian said. "She's never brought a casserole." "No." She looked at the door Mrs. Pruitt had closed behind her. "Things are changing slowly." "Everything real changes slowly," she said. "The fast changes are usually the ones that don't last." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to show you something." He led her outside, around the back of the house, past the site of the ruined feed barn, to the flat field that ran behind the property toward the western rise. It was late afternoon, the light going golden and flat in the way it did out here, the kind of light that made even struggling land look temporarily magnificent. He pointed to the field. "Next spring," he said, "if we make it through the court case with the land intact, this section could carry a second herd. Better grazing than the south. I've been thinking about it for 2 years, but there wasn't any point in planning when I didn't know if we'd still have the land." She looked at the field. "It's good land," she said, because it was. She could see it the way it ran level, the direction the water would drain in spring, the grass that would come back green and thick given the chance. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "I haven't talked about the future much. It felt like there wasn't one to plan for." She looked at him. He was looking at the field, not at her. The way he said important things, sometimes to the middle distance, to the land or the fire or the maps, not directly, because direct was still hard for him. "There's one now," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said. But the way he said it was different from the careful maybes of the early weeks. It was a maybe that meant yes, if everything holds. A maybe that was a planning word. She looked at the field, gold in the afternoon light, and thought about what she'd told Chadwick in that tobacco-smelling office, that manageable wasn't a future, and she wanted something more than manageable. She thought she might be standing in it, damaged and uncertain, and requiring enormous amounts of work, but real, genuinely real. She didn't say any of this to him. She just stood beside him in the field and looked at the land. And then she became aware that she was warm, despite the cold, not from the air, from standing close enough to him that his arm was brushing hers, and neither of them had moved away from it. The light faded, the field went gray. "Come inside," she said. "I'll start supper." He followed her in. And 3 weeks later, on a night in December, when the temperature dropped to something that made the walls of the house creak, and the fire was the only sound in the world, he knocked on the frame of her open door and stood there for a moment, in the way of a man who'd made a decision and was standing on the other side of it. And she looked at him from across the room, and neither of them said a word, because there wasn't anything left that needed to be said. What happened then was theirs and not the territories, not the associations, not Red Hollows. It happened in the quiet of a cold December night when 2 people who had both spent too long in the margins of other people's plans finally chose each other for their own reasons. Without apology, without planning it, and with all the imperfection of 2 people who'd been separately broken and were not entirely sure yet how the pieces fit. It was not a solution to anything. The land case was still pending. Voss was still out there. The winter was still brutal, and the feed barn was still half rebuilt, and the future was still uncertain. But some things matter not because they solve a problem, but because they are true. And this was true. What neither of them knew, lying in the dark while the temperature outside fell, and the walls creaked and the fire burned low, was that this night would become the one thing Voss could not touch, not because of law or documentation or the testimony of witnesses, but because of what it left behind. A life, beginning, small and new and not yet visible, but there. January came in mean and stayed that way. The cold that had made the walls creak in December deepened into something more serious, the kind of cold that killed livestock if you weren't paying attention, that froze water pipes in the night and split fence posts at the grain, and made every morning's first hour a damage assessment before it was anything else. Colton was out before light most days, and Lillian was up not long after, and they worked the ranch the way the ranch needed to be worked in winter, without sentiment, without breaks that weren't strictly necessary, with the focused practicality of two people who understood that the land didn't care about anything happening between them and would punish inattention regardless. What was between them was not discussed. That wasn't avoidance, it was the nature of it at that early stage. It was present in the mornings when he came in cold from the barn checks, and she handed him the coffee without looking up from whatever she was doing, and he took it and stood close enough that their arms touched the table while they went over whatever the day needed. It was present in the evenings by the fire. It was present in the way he'd started saying her name at the beginning of sentences, where he hadn't before, not as a call for attention, but as a way of including her. Lillian, the north fence is going to need work before February. Like she was a fixed point in his orientation. Like she'd always been there. Neither of them put words to it, because neither of them fully trusted words yet, and because the situation with us was still sitting on top of everything else like a stone. And there was a practical understanding between them that the emotional ground they'd found was fragile, and they would not risk it by dragging it into the daylight before it was ready. She knew in January that something was different about her body. She didn't say anything. She held it alone for 2 weeks the way she'd held the physician's letter alone, not from dishonesty, but from the need to be certain before she made it real to anyone else. The letter had said likely. It had not said impossible. She'd known that. She'd kept it at a careful distance, that knowing, because hoping for something the physician had said was unlikely, was a particular kind of vulnerability she hadn't been willing to expose. By the end of January, she was certain. She sat with that certainty for 3 days. She didn't know how to say it. She'd spent 4 months after the letter learning not to grieve it, not to look at it directly, and now the thing she'd unlearned hoping for had happened, couldn't find the shape of the feeling because it was too large and too complicated, and underneath it, beneath the stunned disbelief and the something that was almost joy, there was fear. Specific, practical fear that she recognized as the right kind of fear, to have not the shapeless kind, but the kind with edges and reasons. Voss's man had said it in November, standing at her kitchen door with his practiced smile. Red Hollow is a small territory. It would be unfortunate if certain arrangements were complicated. She'd understood it as a threat to the land case. Now she understood it could mean something else entirely. Child was not just a personal matter out here. In a territory where a man's right to his land was tied to his ability to hold it, a man with a family was also a man with vulnerabilities. Voss was the kind of person who cataloged vulnerabilities. She told Colton on a Wednesday evening in February because she'd made herself wait until she was sure and then made herself wait 3 more days until she'd decided what she thought about it. And then she'd stopped waiting because it was his, and he had a right to know. He was at the table with the court paperwork, a new filing from Voss's lawyers, a counter-challenge to the Laramie submission. That was exactly what Cal Hendricks had predicted, designed to delay rather than win. Colton had been going through it with the careful, grinding attention of a man who was not a reading man, but had made himself become one out of necessity. She sat down across from him and waited until he looked up. Then she told him. He went very still. It was a different stillness from the one she'd catalogued over the months, not the controlled stillness of a man managing emotion, but something prior to that, something before management was possible. He looked at her in a way that had nothing practiced in it. The physician said he started. I know what the physician said. How certain are you? Certain. He set the papers down. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment, large hands, scarred in 2 places from the work. One knuckle still not right from where it had been broken years ago, and healed wrong. And then he looked up at her and said, very quietly, Lillian. She waited. Are you all right? It was not the question she'd expected, and the unexpectedness of it hit her somewhere central. Not are you sure? Not what does this mean for the case? Not the dozen practical concerns that were legitimate and real. Just first, before everything else, are you all right? Yes, she said. And then because it was him, and she'd stopped lying to herself months ago. I'm frightened. Of what, Voss? She held his gaze. If he finds out a child is a leverage point, it's something that can be threatened. And we're in the middle of a land case that won't resolve until spring, at the earliest, possibly summer. And we're already on his list of problems he wants to make go away. Colton was quiet for a moment, processing. She watched him move through it, the initial emotion, whatever it was, and then the practical calculation settling in on top of it like a second layer. You're right, he said, he can't know. Not yet. Not until the court case is further along. Not until we're in a stronger position. How long can we? A few months, she said. Maybe 4 before it becomes obvious. Maybe less, he exhaled slowly. Looked at the papers, then back at her. We push harder on the Laramie filing. I'll write to the lawyer in Cheyenne that Bauer recommended. If we can get an actual hearing date set before. Yes, she'd already been thinking along those lines. And the affidavits from the other families. Mrs. Pruitt mentioned 4. We need to get those formally written before Voss has time to apply pressure to any of them. I'll ride to Bowers tomorrow. I'll go to Mrs. Pruitt. He nodded. Then unexpectedly, he stood up from the table and came around to her side of it and stood there for a moment in a way that she'd come to recognize as him wanting to do something he wasn't sure how to do. She stood up. He put his arms around her. Not smooth, he was not a smooth man, and his arms went around her the way a person does, something they haven't done in a long time. With the slight uncertainty of it, but solidly. She stood inside the circle of it and felt the warmth of him and the exhaustion he was carrying and the thing underneath, both of those that was the feeling he didn't have words for. We're going to be all right, he said into her hair. It was rough and imperfect and said like a man deciding something rather than a man who was certain, and that made it more true than certainty would have. I know, she said. They stood there for a moment in the cold kitchen while the fire burned and the wind worked at the corners of the house. Then she stepped back and said, "Sit down, I'll make supper. We have a lot of planning to do." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and sat down. The next 6 weeks were the most intensive of everything they'd built since October. They moved on 3 fronts simultaneously: the legal case, the affidavit collection, and the quiet but urgent effort to get the ranch into a financial position that could withstand whatever Voss was going to do next. Lillian went to Mrs. Pruitt and collected the 4 families she'd mentioned. She went to each household herself, 2 ranching families and 2 town businesses, and sat at their tables and listened to what they had, which turned out to be more than she'd expected. Feed merchant who'd been systematically underpriced by association suppliers until his business was barely viable. A ranching family whose water access had been rerouted through a legal maneuver that had cost them 2 seasons of decent grazing. A widow whose late husband had died, disputing a boundary claim that she believed had been fabricated. Each of them had documentation, partial, imperfect, the kind of record-keeping regular people do when they know something is wrong but don't have the resources to do it properly. Each of them had been keeping it in a box or a drawer for years, waiting for something that would make it worth bringing out. Lillian wrote the affidavits herself in the language she'd learned from her father's surveying work and the legal documents she'd spent months reading. She was not a lawyer. She knew how to describe facts plainly and specifically, in language that placed events in time and connected them to consequences. And she knew how to make a person feel that what they were saying mattered enough to be said carefully. By mid-March, she had 6 signed affidavits, witnessed by Drury at the post office, ready to send to the lawyer in Cheyenne. By then she was showing, obviously not to a stranger. The women noticed, because women always noticed, and Mrs. Pruitt noticed and said nothing, which was its own kind of communication. The lawyer in Cheyenne, a man named Alderman, who had come recommended through Bauer's network, as someone who took land rights cases on a contingency basis when the documentation was strong enough, wrote back. In March, with something that was almost good news. The Laramie filing had survived Voss's counter-challenge. Judge Ferris had declined to dismiss it. There would be a preliminary hearing in April, and if the affidavit package was strong enough, Alderman believed they had a genuine case for a summary finding in their favor, which would resolve the boundary dispute without a full trial. However, his letter said, and Lillian read the however with the particular attention she gave to words that preceded bad news. I have been informed by a contact in Red Hollow that Harlan Voss has engaged the legal firm of Stroud and Marsh in Laramie. Stroud and Marsh have significant relationships with members of the Laramie judiciary, and I would caution against optimism regarding the preliminary hearing timeline. She read the letter twice, then handed it to Colton. He read it and set it down. Stroud and Marsh, he said. You know them? By reputation. They handled the Hendricks case at the end. He pushed the letter away with one finger, a gesture she recognized as him controlling something. They don't win on merit. They win on delay in relationships. Then we need to give Ferris something so solid that relationships don't overcome it. She pulled the letter back and read the relevant section again. Alderman says summary finding. That means Ferris rules without a full trial, based on the strength of the documentation alone. That's what we need to aim for. The affidavits, the original survey, Cal's testimony, All of it compiled into one package that is so factually complete that Voss can't manufacture enough delay to get around it. That's a lot of document work. Yes, she looked at him. I can do it. But I need the originals of everything we have, every filing, every letter, every piece of correspondence from the association. The box is in the bedroom. I know I need to go through all of it again, systematically, and build it into a proper legal record. She paused. It'll take me 2 weeks, maybe 3. He looked at her for a moment, the particular look he'd developed in recent weeks, the one with more awareness in it than the early looks, that tracked how she was doing without asking every hour. She was tired. She'd been tired since January, the specific grinding tiredness of the first months, and she hadn't complained about it, because complaining didn't help anything. But he'd noticed. You're going to work yourself into the ground, he said. I'm going to finish the legal record, she said. Those are different things. Lillian Colton. She kept her voice even and direct. We have maybe 6 weeks before Voss finds out about the baby. When he does, he's going to use it. I don't know exactly how, but I know that a man who burns barns and fabricates survey lines will not hesitate to threaten a pregnancy. I want to be in front of that. I want the case so far advanced by the time he finds out that it doesn't matter what he threatens. He looked at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to read fully, because it was too complicated, the combination of things he felt for her, and the awareness of what she was carrying, and the admiration that he still didn't know how to say, Isagi, and the deep, steady protectiveness that had been building in him since December. All right, he said, but you eat properly and you sleep. I'll handle the outdoor work. Deal, she said. She worked on the legal record at the kitchen table every morning, and some evenings, the box of documents spread around her in an order that probably looked like chaos to anyone else, but made sense to her grouped by date, cross-referenced by type, the associations between individual pieces mapped in a system she'd developed from her father's notation methods. She was building an argument, and like all good arguments, it needed to be not just accurate but navigable. A judge looking at it needed to be able to move through it and arrive at the right conclusion without having to work too hard to get there. Meanwhile, Colton rode the boundary lines and did the repair work and managed the herd with a focused, contained energy that she recognized as him channeling anxiety into physical labor, which was probably the right way to handle anxiety if you were built the way he was built. It was on a Thursday in late March, while she was working through a stack of association correspondence from 1,878, that she found it. She almost missed it. It was folded inside a larger document, a grazing rights letter she'd already cataloged like it had been placed there by accident or in a hurry. It was a single page, written in a different hand from the official association letterhead. The date was March 1877. She read it once, then she put it down on the table and sat very still for a moment. Then she read it again, slowly every word. It was a letter from a man named Perkins. She didn't know the name, but the letter identified him as a deputy registrar in the Laramie County Records Office addressed to Harlan Voss. The letter was personal in tone, which meant it had never been intended for official record. Described the transfer of a land registration from the original Raines claim to a holding company controlled by the association. Described the transfer as having been completed using a survey document that the writer Perkins described as a revision of the original. Revision was the word he used. Not correction, not updated assessment. Revision. And then in the second paragraph, in handwriting that was slightly less careful than the first, as though the writer had relaxed, the original survey by Holt remains on file in the secondary archive as you instructed. As we discussed, its existence does not need to be formally acknowledged unless required by court proceeding. She sat at the table in the cold kitchen for a long time. What this letter said, in the careful language of a man who knew what he was doing was wrong, but was doing it anyway, was that Harlan Voss had known about the original Holt's survey since 1877, had known that the stone marker existed, had instructed a county records official to suppress its relevance, had built the entire 6-year legal assault on the Raines land on a foundation that he knew was fraudulent, not mistaken, not disputed, but deliberately, specifically fraudulent. This wasn't a boundary dispute. This was documented fraud, official fraud involving a county employee. She got up and went to find Colton. He was in the barn. She came in without preamble and held out the letter and waited while he read it. She watched his face go through the things it went through. When he finished, he looked up at her. Where did you find this? Inside the some 1,878 grazing rights correspondence, folded inside. It may have been mixed in accidentally, or someone kept it deliberately and put it somewhere they thought was safe. She paused. Your father kept all of this? Every piece of paper he ever got from the association. His voice was flat. He used to say he didn't know which one would matter. This one matters, she said. Colton, this isn't just the boundary case. This is criminal fraud against a county official. If Alderman sees this, if Ferris sees this, Voss could go to prison. Yes. Or face charges serious enough that the association collapses before it gets to trial. She kept her voice steady. But we have to be careful. If Voss gets word that we have this before it's in front of a judge, he'll move against us. He'll move against us faster and harder than anything he's done before. She held his gaze. We need to get this to Alderman privately, not through the mail. Someone needs to ride to Cheyenne. He was quiet for a moment, reading the letter again. Then he folded it carefully and looked at her. I'll leave tomorrow, he said. Before first light. You'll be gone at least 4 days. I know. She thought about the last time he'd left her alone on the ranch, the 3 days he'd ridden to Laramie in November, and what had been different then. She'd been alone in a way she wasn't now, and there had been no specific threat more immediate than Decker's vague intimidation. This was different. If Voss had anyone watching the ranch, and she had no reason to believe he didn't, a solo rider leaving before dawn and heading toward Cheyenne would be noticed. Go through the Bower land, she said, not the main road. Tom Bower knows the back route south. Ask him to guide you to the county line. Then you can pick up the main road from there without the association's people seeing you leave the territory. He looked at her. You've thought about this before. Think about everything before, she said, in case it becomes necessary. What will you do if someone comes while I'm gone? I'll handle it, she said it plainly. I'm not without resources. Drury knows what we're doing. Cal Hendricks is 10 miles away. Mrs. Pruitt, she stopped. He was looking at her with that expression again, the complicated one. He said. I'll be careful, she said. Go to Cheyenne. Get that letter to Alderman. That's what matters right now. Folded the letter and put it inside his jacket. Talk to Bower tonight. Leave tomorrow before sunup. He paused. Don't answer the door to anyone you don't know. I know. And eat. Actually eat. Not just coffee and whatever's left from breakfast. Despite everything, something almost like a smile moved through her. You're lecturing me about eating. One of us has to. She looked at him, the worn jacket, the jaw that still needed a razor, the serious eyes that had softened in a way she'd watched happen over months, and felt the full weight of everything they were in the middle of. Frightened and certain and grateful in a way she didn't have language for, all at the same time. Come back in 4 days, she said. Don't take longer than 4 days. Come back in 4 days. He left before she was fully awake. She almost missed it. She heard the horse and got to the window in time to see him moving across the dark yard in the direction of Bower's land. And then the darkness took him. She stood at the window for a while, until the cold got through the glass, and then she went and put the kettle on and sat down at the table with the documents and worked. The first day was fine. The second day was longer. She did the morning chores herself, not the heavy work. Nothing that strained, and managed the water and the feed and the 3 horses that remained on the property, and she worked on the legal record in the afternoon. And she ate at the table alone in the evenings and read from the shelf of books, which she'd discovered included 1 volume on frontier land law and 2 novels and a guide to cattle breeding. She'd read the land law book twice now, but the novels she hadn't touched yet. On the second evening, she picked up one of the novels. She read 2 pages and put it down. She wasn't afraid exactly. She was vigilant, which was different. She moved through the house with a heightened attention to sounds outside it, to the quality of silence that meant nothing was there, and the quality of silence that meant something was. She kept the Winchester in the kitchen during the day, and the bedroom at night, which was what Colton had told her to do the first time he'd left, and she found she was sleeping less deeply than usual, which was either vigilance or the pregnancy or probably both. On the morning of the 3rd day, Decker came. She heard the horse from the kitchen and went to the window and recognized the lean, careful-eyed man from November on a gray horse at the edge of the yard. He didn't dismount immediately. He sat on the horse and looked at the house the way a man does when he's assessing whether the occupant is alone. Picked up the Winchester, not to use to have. Then she went to the door and opened it before he knocked. He looked at the rifle and then at her face, and his expression did the thing she'd noticed before, that practiced reassembly into pleasantness. Mrs. Raines, he said. Mr. Raines not around. What do you want, Decker? Just a friendly visit. He didn't dismount. His eyes moved past her into the visible portion of the kitchen. Mr. Voss wanted me to convey his concern about your well-being. Married life on a frontier ranch can be taxing, especially for a woman in a delicate situation. Everything in her went cold. She kept her face absolutely still. I don't know what you mean, of course. He smiled. The smile was doing less work this time. A woman in your circumstances, with a court case pending, and a husband who travels. Mr. Voss simply wants you to know that he's thinking of you, that he hopes everything resolves comfortably. For everyone. He knew, Voss knew. She didn't know how, Mrs. Pruitt had said nothing. She was sure of it, and the women who'd noticed were women she trusted. But Voss had been watching, or had paid someone to watch, and what he'd seen had told him what he needed to know. You tell Mr. Voss, she said, that I appreciate his concern. I'll do that. He touched the brim of his hat. He also wanted me to mention that the court case, it's a difficult thing to see through. A case like that. Expensive, emotionally taxing. If you and Mr. Raines were interested in revisiting the association's previous offer, the 40% grazing arrangement, Mr. Voss would be happy to discuss it. No hard feelings. The answer was no in November, she said. It's no now. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression that was not the pleasant mask, something more direct. Things change, he said. Circumstances change. That's all, Mr. Voss is saying. Good day, Decker. He looked at her for one more moment, and then he turned the horse and rode back toward the road. She stood at the door until he was gone. Then she went inside and sat down at the table and put the Winchester across her knees and stayed very still for 5 minutes, letting the adrenaline move through her without letting it make decisions. He knew. Voss knew, which meant the timeline she'd built in her head 4 or 5 months before it became obvious, before he could use it, was gone. He knew now in March, with the April hearing still weeks away, and Colton in Cheyenne and the legal case not yet at the place where it would be protected. Picked up a pen and started writing. Not the legal documents, a letter to Alderman in Cheyenne, to be sent today through Drury at the post office. The situation has become urgent. Voss is aware of our personal circumstances and has made an implicit threat. We need the hearing moved forward if possible. The affidavit package is complete. The additional evidence. She stopped. She wasn't going to put the Perkins letter in writing, in a letter that would travel through the mail. Colton is traveling with supplemental evidence that changes the nature of the case. Please advise on timing. She folded it, sealed it, and put on her coat and walked to town. Drury took the letter without asking questions, which was why she'd come to trust him. He was a man who understood that certain things were better processed after the fact than during, and who had the particular quality of someone who'd been postmaster for 30 years and had learned that the mail itself was often less important than the fact of being someone who moved it reliably. You all right? He asked. The first personal question he'd ever asked her. Working on it, she said. He nodded and she left. Colton came back on the 4th day, exactly when he'd said he would, which she registered with a relief she'd been pretending all day she wasn't feeling. Came in dusty and tired and sat down at the table, and she put coffee in front of him and said, without preamble, Decker was here. Day before yesterday, he looked up. Voss knows about the baby. The expression on his face moved through several things quickly. She watched him arrive at the controlled version. What did he say? She told him. All of it. Precise, the way she'd been telling him things since October, not softened, not dramatized, just accurately reported. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. Then he said, Alderman read the Perkins letter, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said it was the most significant piece of evidence in a land fraud case he'd seen in 15 years of practice. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He's filing a request for emergency hearing advancement based on witness interference. Perkins' letter, Alderman says, it changes the character of the case. It's not just a boundary dispute. It's documented fraud involving a county official. Can Ferris move the hearing? He already has. Alderman sent a wire this morning before I left. Hearing is set for April 3rd. He looked at her. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She let that settle. Voss is going to move before then, she said. I know. He's going to try something. Not just Decker at the door. I know. He set the cup down, which is why I stopped at Bowers on the way back. Tom's coming out tomorrow with his 2 hands. Cal Hendricks said he'd come the day after. We're not going to have the ranch unmanned while this is going up. She looked at him. I thought about what you said, he said, that I fight alone, that I'm better at it than I think, but not as good as I'd be with someone beside me. He held her gaze. I'm trying to learn that. She felt something move through her that was too full to name, not just gratitude, not just love, though both of those were in it, but something about the fact of being seen, of having said something true about someone, and having them receive it and act on it. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, we can hold the ranch for 3 weeks. Yes, he said, and then quietly, all of it, we hold all of it. She understood what he meant by all of it, the land and the case, and the thing growing between them, and the other thing growing, that they hadn't yet named aloud to each other, the one that had changed the shape of everything. Yes, she said, all of it. She moved to start supper. Caught her hand as she passed, not dramatically. Just caught it. Held it for a second, looking at her with the expression that wasn't easy for him to produce, but that she'd learned to read. Thank you, he said, for not running when Decker came. Where would I go? She said. It was meant lightly, and he almost smiled at it, but they both knew the truth underneath it. She had somewhere to go. She'd had somewhere to go since November. She was here because she chose to be here, every single day, and that was different from being here, because there was no alternative. He knew that. She knew he knew it. She squeezed his hand and went to start supper. Tom Bauer arrived the next morning on a horse that had seen better years, with 2 ranch hands who introduced themselves as Pete, and a man everyone called Skinny, for reasons that were visually self-evident, and who looked at the property with the careful working man's appraisal of people who knew land and wanted to understand what they were being asked to help hold. Tom himself was a barrel-chested man in his 60s who had the slightly uncomfortable manner of someone doing a generous thing and not wanting to be thanked for it extensively. He shook Colton's hand with the stiffness of 2 people who'd once had a dispute and were choosing to put it in the past without making a production of it. Nice place, he said, looking at the ranch. Cleaner than I remember. Had some help, Colton said. Bauer looked at Lillian with a directness that wasn't rude, just honest. You're the one who wrote up my affidavit, he said. Yes, you know land law some. My father was a surveyor. He nodded, satisfied. Good enough. He turned back to Colton. Where do you want us? They set up a watch rotation, not military. Nothing formal. Just a practical agreement about who would be where at what hours. Enough that the ranch was never unobserved from all sides at once. Cal Hendricks came the day after with his own man, and what had been a struggling ranch with 2 occupants became, for the weeks ahead, something more like a settlement, not comfortable, not easy, but defended. Lillian cooked for more people than she'd ever cooked for and managed the provisions with the same methodical attention she'd applied to everything else, and she noticed that being surrounded by people, by the particular busy noise of a working defense, made the vigilance easier to sustain. It was the silence that was hardest. The noise meant company, and company meant witnesses, and witnesses were a form of safety that Voss was going to have a harder time working around. He tried anyway. 9 days before the hearing, one of Voss's lawyers arrived in Red Hollow with paperwork from the Laramie court clerk's office, a request for postponement based on procedural grounds, citing insufficient notice of the hearing advancement. Alderman countered it the same day. Ferris ruled on it within 48 hours. Postponement denied. 7 days before the hearing, someone no one saw, who attempted to access the property after dark, and was met by Pete at the fence line. Nothing violent. The man turned and left, but the attempt itself was noted, and Colton sent a written account of it to Alderman, who added it to the record as evidence of ongoing interference. 4 days before the hearing, Harlan Voss himself rode out to the ranch for the first time. Lillian was in the kitchen when Cal came to the window and said quietly, "Ryder, it's Voss." She went still. Then she dried her hands, folded the cloth, and went to stand on the porch. She'd seen him before, at a distance in town, the broad-shouldered man, with the bourbon glass in the mental image she'd constructed, from what she knew of him. In person, he was both more and less than that image. More because there was a quality to him composed, expensive, the ease of a man who'd been powerful for long enough that it had settled into his posture. Less because up close he looked like what he was, a man who was losing, and knew it, and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. He pulled up at the edge of the yard and looked at the men visible on the property, Pete by the barn, Cal at the fence line, Skinny visible on the north rise, and his face did something that wasn't quite acknowledgement, but was close to it. Then he looked at Lillian. "Mrs. Raines," he said. "Mr. Voss, you've been busy." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ranch. "Then I built this territory," he said. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded almost genuine, the statement of a man who actually believed it. 15 years. Every road, every water right, every piece of legal infrastructure this territory has. I built it, or I paid for it, or I negotiated it. The people here, they don't like me, but they live on what I built. You also destroyed 4 ranches, she said, and suppressed a survey document since 1877 and corrupted a county records official. His expression didn't change. Not surprised, the absence of surprise told her he'd known about the Perkins letter, or at least suspected she had it. That's a very serious accusation. It's in front of Judge Ferris in 4 days. He looked at her for a long moment. A long, flat, assessing look that she held without difficulty, because she'd been holding hard looks since October and she'd gotten good at it. You could still walk away from this, he said. The case. All of it. I would make it worth your while. No, she said. Carrying a child, he said. A woman in your situation. Don't, she said. Her voice was quiet and completely flat. Don't use that. Don't even try. Something moved in his expression. Something that was almost respect. Almost. The specific kind of respect a man like Voss had for an adversary he'd underestimated. Picked up his reins. See you in court, Mrs. Raines. Yes, she said, you will. He turned the horse and rode back toward the road. She stood on the porch until he was gone. Then she turned and went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands for exactly 30 seconds, not from fear, but from the release of the effort of maintaining everything she'd had to maintain for the last 2 minutes. Then she lifted her head, straightened up, and went back to the documents. 3 days. 3 days until the hearing. The Perkins letter was in Alderman's hands. The affidavits were filed. The stone marker was documented. The arson was documented. The witness interference was documented. 3 days she picked up her pen and kept working. But what none of them knew, yet not Lillian, not Colton, not Alderman in Cheyenne, was that Harlan Voss did not lose gracefully. He never had. And a man who'd spent 15 years building something was not going to let a woman from the East and a stubborn rancher dismantle it in a county courtroom without one final attempt to change the terms of the fight entirely. What he was planning, he set in motion that same evening, in the back room of the Red Hollow Land and Cattle Association, with the same bourbon glass and the same flat, deliberate calm with which he'd made every decision for 15 years. Only this time, the decision he made would change everything, not in the way he intended, but in a way none of them could have predicted. 2 nights before the hearing, they came in the dark. Not Decker this time. Not the lean, careful-eyed man with the practiced smile. Voss had sent 4 of them men Lillian didn't recognize, which meant they weren't from Red Hollow, which meant Voss had brought them in specifically for this. Meant he'd planned it far enough in advance that he'd had time to source people who had no local reputation to protect. She heard them before she saw them. She was awake. She'd been sleeping badly for a week, the vigilance and the pregnancy conspiring to keep her in a state of half-rest that left her alert to sounds that shouldn't be there. What she heard was the specific quality of silence that meant something was moving in it. The horses, 3 or 4 of them, coming in slow from the east, which was the direction a man who knew the property would choose if he wanted to approach without being seen from the main road. She was on her feet and at the bedroom door in seconds. Colton was already awake. She nearly walked into him in the hallway. East side, she said low, I heard. He had the Winchester. She went back for the handgun from the nightstand, a Colt revolver she'd learned to use adequately in the weeks since the fire, because adequately was what the situation required, and she was not a person who left herself with less capability than the situation required. Caught her arm in the dark, not to stop her to hold on for exactly 1 second. 1 brief, anchoring second, and then let go. She went to the east window. He went out the back. Through the glass, in the thin moonlight, she could make out the shapes 4 horses at the fence line, 4 men dismounting. Couldn't see faces. She could see that 2 of them were moving toward the barn, and 2 were moving toward the house, which told her the plan: fire and confrontation simultaneously. The same tactic as the feed barn, but larger, more committed. 2 nights before the hearing, because Voss had calculated correctly that destroying the ranch and its occupants 2 nights before wasn't just intimidation, it was the elimination of witnesses. She moved away from the window and went through the kitchen to the door that opened onto the west side of the house, away from where they were coming from. She opened it quietly and stepped out into the cold. Cal Hendricks was on watch on the north rise. Tom Bauer's men were in the bunkhouse, old and long Onsbers, but structurally sound enough to sleep in, which was where Pete and Skinny had been. She'd trusted in the rotation. She'd trusted in the preparation. Now she needed to trust in the people. She fired twice into the air. The sound of it in the cold silence was enormous. It cracked across the flat land like something physical, and she heard the horses at the fence line react. and she heard shouting from the east side where Colton was, and she heard the bunkhouse door slam open as Pete and Skinny came out at a run. What followed was not an unclean fight. It was the messy, confused, partially dark chaos of people who'd been caught mid-plan, reacting to a situation that had gone wrong faster than they'd expected. Two of the men ran immediately, the ones who'd been heading for the barn, the ones whose plan depended on surprise and opportunity, and who had no appetite for a stand-up confrontation. The other two were more committed, and for 5 minutes there was a situation at the east fence line that Lillian could hear but not see, and those 5 minutes were the worst 5 minutes of the whole night because the sounds told her something was happening and didn't tell her enough about what. Then she heard Colton's voice loud and clear, "Down. Stay down." She went around the east side of the house. Colton had one man flat on the ground with his knee in the man's back, and the Winchester aimed at the second, who had his hands up with the specific compliance of someone who'd just done the math and didn't like the answer. Pete was behind him with a length of fence post. Cal Hendricks was coming down from the north rise at a run. The man on the ground had a split lip and was going to have a very bad eye in the morning. Colton had blood on his jaw from somewhere, she couldn't tell how serious in the dark. "You're all right," she said. "Not a question." "I'm all right," he said without looking away from the men. "Get the rope from the barn." Second hook inside the door. She got the rope. They tied both men to the fence posts, not brutally but securely, the way you tie something you want to stay put until morning. Cal rode to town for the sheriff before dawn, which was a calculated decision. They wanted Doyle to see the men before Voss had time to get to him, wanted the situation documented by county authority before it could be reframed. Doyle arrived at sunup. He looked at the two men tied to the fence posts. He looked at the tracks where the other two had ridden off. He looked at Colton's jaw and Lillian's hands and the burn kit that had been staged near the barn door because they'd anticipated fire and prepared for it. He wrote in his notebook for a long time. "These men aren't from the territory," he said. "No," Colton said, "brought in specifically. That would be my assessment." Doyle wrote some more. Then he looked up and said something that Lillian suspected cost him something to say. "I'll need to take a formal statement. Both of you today before the hearing, so it's on record before anything else happens." "We'll come in this afternoon," she said. He nodded. He untied the men, put them on their horses with their hands secured, and rode them toward town without another word. After he was gone, Tom Bauer stood at the fence line with his arms crossed and said to no one in particular, "Voss is getting desperate." "Desperate men make mistakes," Cal said. "They also dangerous ones," Lillian said. Both men looked at her. "Don't mistake desperation for weakness. He's going to do something else. We don't know what. We need to be at that courtroom tomorrow, and we need to be careful about how we get there." She didn't sleep. After the statements were given to Doyle that afternoon, and the formal record was made, 2 men in custody, attempted property assault, evidence of premeditated arson attempt, all of it written into the county record where it couldn't be quietly disappeared. She came home and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the documents she'd spent 6 weeks building and let herself feel, for a few minutes, the full weight of everything she'd been holding at a controlled distance for months. She was tired. Not the physical tiredness of the work, which she'd gotten used to, but the bone-deep tiredness of sustained alertness of being the person who thought ahead, who noticed the things others missed, who made sure nothing fell through the cracks while also doing the work of the ranch and managing her own body's demands and maintaining the appearance of a composure she didn't always feel. She was 5 months pregnant in 2 weeks. She was 48 hours from a court hearing that would either resolve 6 years of injustice or give Harlan Voss another set of tools to delay and damage and wear them down. She was sitting in a kitchen that she'd fixed and cleaned and made functional from a state of neglect, in a house that had been filled with a particular kind of loneliness before she arrived. And the man who lived in it was outside in the dark checking the fence lines because neither of them had been willing to simply go to bed and assume the night was safe. She put her hand flat on the table and breathed. The door opened. Colton came in, checked the room with the quick scan he'd developed over the past weeks, and then looked at her properly. He sat down. He didn't say anything for a moment, which was his way he sat with things before he spoke about them, and she'd stopped finding this difficult and started finding it honest. "We're as ready as we can be," he said. "Yes. Alderman's in Laramie tonight. He'll be at the courthouse by 8. "I know." He looked at her hands on the table. "What are you thinking?" She considered the question. "I'm thinking about my father," she said. "He used to say that the only survey that matters is the one you can prove. Not the one that's true, the one you can stand in front of a judge and demonstrate with physical evidence. She looked at the stack of documents. We can prove everything. The original survey, the Perkins letter, the arson, the witness interference last night. It's all there. It's all documented. Then we're going to be all right. Yes, she said it and meant it. I just wanted to say it out loud. He put his hand over hers on the table. He did it the way he did everything affectionate, not smooth, not practiced, but real. His hand was large and warm and calloused, and she felt the weight of it as a physical anchor. Tomorrow, he said, whatever happens in that courtroom, I want you to know. He stopped, looked at their hands. I didn't have anything worth fighting for before you came. I had the fight, but not the thing behind it. She looked at him. I'm not good at saying things like this, he said, but I wanted to say it before tomorrow, in case. Don't, she said gently. In case nothing. We go in tomorrow and we present the case and we come home. I know, he exhaled. You were supposed to be a joke. That's what they sent you here as. And you came and you read my surveys and you went to talk to Cal and you found that letter and you stood on the porch and told Voss no to his face while you're carrying our child. He shook his head. I just want you to know that I know what you've done. What you are. She felt the fullness of it move through her. Not sentiment, something heavier and more real than sentiment. Colton, she said. Yeah, I know, she said. It covered everything she meant, and he understood it. They sat at the table for a while in the quiet of the ranch, his hand over hers, the fire going low, the night outside finally still. The courthouse in Red Hollow was the largest building on the main street, which wasn't saying a great deal. It had 2 floors and a door with a proper frame and enough room inside for perhaps 30 people seated. When Lillian and Colton arrived at 8:30 the morning of the hearing, there were already more than 30 people trying to fit in. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected Alderman and his clerk, the association's lawyers from Stroud and Marsh, whatever witnesses had been called, and Judge Ferris. She had not expected Tom Bauer and Cal Hendricks seated in the second row. She had not expected Mrs. Pruitt and the widow whose husband had died disputing Voss's boundary claim. She had not expected Drury from the post office, or the feed merchant whose business had been systematically underpriced, or the Reyes family from north of town, or any of the dozen other faces she recognized from months of conversations and affidavit sessions, all of them sitting in a county courtroom at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning. Stopped inside the door. Colton beside her went still. Cal Hendricks saw them and nodded once. That was all just a nod, the acknowledgement of people who decided to show up for something without needing to make a production of it. Alderman came to meet them. He was a thin man in his 40s with the alert, somewhat compressed manner, someone who'd spent his career making arguments under time pressure. He shook Colton's hand and looked at Lillian with the evaluating gaze he'd been directing at her since their first correspondence, trying to calibrate her. She understood, trying to understand what kind of resource she was. Perkins' letter, he said low, is the center of the case. Everything else is context. If Ferris accepts it as evidence of systematic fraud, the boundary claim falls and we push for criminal referral simultaneously. He looked at the Stroud and Marsh lawyers across the room, 2 men in good suits who had the easy posture of men accustomed to being the most prepared people in the room. They're going to challenge the chain of custody on the letter, how it was found, who had access to it, whether it was tampered with. It was found in my husband's father's documents, Lillian said, folded inside some 1,878 grazing right letter. The paper is consistent with the period. The handwriting can be compared against Perkins's other correspondence if his records are subpoenaed, and the specific legal language in the letter references association filings that are verifiable in the county record. Alderman looked at her for a moment. You've thought through their challenge. I've thought through all the challenges, she said. That's what the last 6 weeks were for. He almost smiled. All right, he said. Stay close. I'm going to call you as a witness on the survey documentation. She nodded, and they took their seats. Harlan Voss arrived 5 minutes before the hearing began. He came in through the back with Decker and 2 of the Stroud and Marsh lawyers, and sat at the respondents' table with the composed, expensive presence of a man who'd been in courtrooms before and found them manageable. He didn't look at Lillian or Colton when he came in. Judge Ferris was a compact man in his 60s who moved with the economical authority of someone who'd been a judge long enough that he didn't need to perform the role anymore. Called the hearing to order, established the basis for the expedited schedule, and said plainly that he'd reviewed the preliminary filings and had questions which was not the opening that Stroud and Marsh had been expecting. She could tell by the slight adjustment in posture at their table. What followed was 4 hours of legal argument that Lillian tracked with total attention. Alderman presented the original Holt survey first, then the stone marker documentation with Drury's attestation, then the comparison with the association's revised survey. The Stroud and Marsh lawyer challenged the marker documentation on procedural grounds. Ferris overruled the challenge in 2 sentences and moved on. The arson report came next, then the affidavits, 6 of them, laid out in chronological order. Then Cal Hendricks on the stand, in his flat, precise voice, describing what had happened to his brother's ranch with the specific detail of a man who'd committed it to memory because he'd known someday it would need to be said in exactly the right place. Stroud and Marsh lawyers cross-examined him hard. He held up. He'd been holding it for 2 years. 40 minutes of cross-examination wasn't going to shake something that solid. Then Alderman called Lillian. She walked to the stand and sat down and looked at the room, the packed benches, the 2 lawyers, Voss at the respondent's table still not looking at her, Colton in the front row watching her with the careful attention of someone trusting a person completely and needing that trust to hold. Alderman walked her through the survey documentation, the discovery of the Holt benchmark, the notation system her father had taught her, the specific mathematical discrepancy between the original and the association's revision. She answered precisely, in the language of survey practice, in the language of legal documentation, without embellishment or emotion, because the facts were the argument and she didn't need to decorate them. When the cross-examination came, the Stroud and Marsh lawyer tried 3 different angles. He questioned her credentials. She had none formal, she said, but described her father's practice and her work within it. He questioned her objectivity as the wife of the plaintiff, pointed out calmly that objectivity was a question of methodology, not relationship, and that the methodology was verifiable by any qualified surveyor. Questioned the chain of custody on the original survey copy from the county recorder's office. She produced the receipt for the request, in her own name, dated November of the previous year, through official county channels. He sat down. Ferris looked at the documents. He looked at the Perkins letter, which Alderman submitted last carefully, building to it, establishing the context of documented fraud before laying the letter itself on the judge's bench. The room was quiet while Ferris read it. Voss, for the first time since the hearing began, moved slightly in his chair. Ferris set the letter down. He looked at the Stroud and Marsh table. "Counsel," he said, "your response to this document." What followed was 12 minutes of legal argument that attempted to challenge the letter's authenticity, its relevance, and its admissibility. Ferris listened to all of it with the expression of a man processing information he'd already substantially made up his mind about, but was giving proper procedural space. Then he said, "I'm going to need to recess." The recess was 40 minutes. Lillian sat in the hallway with Colton and Alderman, and nobody talked very much, because there was nothing useful to say while they were waiting, and they all understood that. At one point, Colton said quietly, "To no one in particular, my father filed in this county for 6 years. "I know," Alderman said. "He died before it was ever heard properly." Alderman was quiet for a moment. "I know that too." Nobody said anything else. When Ferris came back, the room reassembled in a silence that had a different quality from the morning's silence, heavier, more concentrated. Ferris sat. He looked at his notes. He looked at the Perkins letter. Then he looked up at the room and said, in the measured, plain voice he'd used all morning, "In the matter of Raines versus the Red Hollow Land and Cattle Association, I find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts related to the boundary dispute. The original Holt survey of 1,871 is the operative document. The association's revised survey is ruled fraudulent. The eastern boundary line is restored to the original designation." Paused. Additionally, the Perkins letter raises serious questions of official misconduct that fall outside the scope of today's civil hearing. I am referring the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's Office for criminal review. He looked directly at Voss. "Mr. Voss, I would strongly advise you to make yourself available to that office." Voss's face did not change, but Decker beside him went visibly pale. Ferris set down his papers. "This hearing is adjourned." The room moved the way rooms move when something that's been held in suspension is suddenly released, a collective exhale, chairs scraping, voices beginning low and then building. Alderman was writing quickly. The Stroud and Marsh lawyers were conferring with each other in the contained, rapid way of people recalculating. Colton was very still. She touched his arm. He looked at her, and whatever was in his expression in that moment was something she'd never seen there before. Not the controlled stillness, not the guarded management, but something wide open and raw and real. The face of a man who'd carried something impossible for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "It's done," she said. He nodded. He put his hand over hers on his arm and held it. Across the room, Harlan Voss stood and buttoned his jacket and walked toward the door. He passed within 10 feet of them. He didn't look at Lillian, but at the door he stopped. He stood there for a moment with his back to the room. Then he walked out. It was not an admission. It was not an apology. But it was a man leaving a room he'd expected to control, walking away from something he couldn't take back, and that was its own kind of ending. Cal Hendricks appeared at Colton's shoulder. He put his hand out. Colton shook it, and Cal said, "Walt would have been glad." And that was all he said, and Colton nodded and didn't trust himself to speak. Mrs. Pruitt materialized, because Mrs. Pruitt always materialized when things of consequence occurred. She looked at Lillian with an expression that was as close to warmth as Lillian had seen on her face. "Told them," she said, "when you first came. I said you wouldn't last the month." She paused. "I was wrong about that." "Yes," Lillian said. "I'm not wrong often." "I imagine not." She looked around the room and then back at Lillian. "The casserole dish," she said. "I'd like it back when you have a chance." And that somehow, in the middle of everything, almost made Lillian laugh. They rode home in the late afternoon, the two of them, the light going long and golden across the land. The wide, flat land that was theirs properly, legally, finally theirs, with the document to prove it, and the court record to support it, and the Perkins letter in the Territorial Attorney General's office, where it would do what it needed to do. Colton was quiet for most of the ride. She let him be quiet because she understood what he was doing with it, processing something that had been the whole shape of his life for so long, that the absence of it was going to take time to understand. When the ranch came into view, he pulled up for a moment and looked at it. She pulled up beside him. The main house, the barn, the rebuilt feed storage, the fence lines running out toward the eastern pasture, where the stone marker sat in the creek mud, exactly where James Holt had placed it in 1871. The wide field behind the property, where Colton had stood in the cold autumn light and talked about a second herd, about spring, about planning for a future when he'd thought there wasn't one. "What do you want to do first?" she asked. He thought about it. "Fix the north gate," he said. "It's been sticking for a month." She looked at him, and then he said, "I want to start clearing the west field. If we're going to run a second herd by fall, we need to start now." She felt something move through her that was not complicated for once, just straightforward and clear. "All right," she said. "You fix the gate. I'll start on the planting records if we're expanding. We need to think about the supply situation before spring." He nodded. Then he said, "Lillian, yes. Thank you." He said it plainly, looking at the ranch. Not at her, at the ranch, which she understood was how he said the deepest things. For all of it. She looked at what he was looking at. The struggling, difficult, imperfect, entirely real place they were building together. "Come on," she said. "Gate won't fix itself." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, and they rode the rest of the way home in the long afternoon light, side by side, toward everything that was still ahead of them. The north gate got fixed that same evening. Colton worked at it until the light was nearly gone, and Lillian could hear the sound of the hammer from the kitchen where she was making notes in the supply ledger, the steady, purposeful rhythm of a man doing a task that had been waiting too long and was finally getting done. There was something in that sound, in its ordinariness, that felt more significant than the courtroom had. Courtroom had been the ending of one thing. The gate was the beginning of something else. You could mark time by the large events, but it was the small ones that told you where you actually were. She made soup from what was in the root cellar and cornbread from what was on the shelf and set both on the table when she heard him come in and wash up at the basin outside. He came through the door with wood shavings on his jacket and the particular satisfied tiredness of physical work completed, sat down, and ate without ceremony. After a while he said, "Gate's done, I heard. The fence line on the west section needs another look before we start clearing. There's a section near the creek bend that's been soft since the spring thaw. I'll put it in the work list." He looked at her over the table. Not with anything loaded in it, just the simple, direct attention of a man who'd gotten into the habit of looking at her and hadn't stopped. "You should sleep," he said. "I will. You didn't sleep last night." "Neither did you." He had no response to this because it was true. They'd both been awake before the men came and awake after, and the hearing had taken whatever remained of the morning's reserves. and she was tired in a way that went past the bones and into something that didn't have a good word for it. But she finished the supply notes first, because she was who she was, and then she went to bed, and she slept without waking for the first time in 2 weeks. Spring came the way it always came to that country, not gently. Not with any particular regard for what the people on the land needed from it, but with the aggressive, muddy insistence of a season that had its own schedule. Creek rose. The fence posts that had been solid through winter shifted in the softening ground. The cattle that had been managed through the cold months moved and needed moving again and again as the pasture returned to something edible. Lillian worked the ranch through April and into May in the way she'd worked it since October, practically consistently, without romanticizing what it was. There were good days and bad days, and days where everything that could go wrong did, and the pregnancy made some of the physical work impossible, and the rest of it harder, and she adjusted accordingly, which was what you did. Territorial Attorney General's office sent a letter in late April. The Perkins matter was under formal investigation. Harlan Voss had been asked to present himself in Laramie for a preliminary interview. The Red Hollow Land and Cattle Association had suspended its operations pending the investigation's outcome. Colton read the letter twice, folded it, and put it with the other documents in the box his father had kept. He didn't say much about it. She understood why the satisfaction of it was real but complicated, threaded through with everything it had cost and everything it had taken too long, and all the years his father had spent fighting and not winning. You couldn't feel cleanly good about something that should have happened 15 years earlier. You could feel that it was done, which was its own thing, separate from good. Cal Hendricks rode out in the first week of May to say that Walt had been informed, that his brother in Cheyenne had received the letter from Alderman explaining the case outcome, the ruling, the criminal referral. He said Walt had sat with the letter for a long time, and then said he wasn't coming back, that he'd built something new in Cheyenne and wasn't willing to unmake it, but that he was glad. Just glad. Cal said this, standing at the fence line in the spring light, with the matter-of-fact delivery of a man reporting facts, and then he said he'd be getting back to the mill, and he rode away without making anything more of it, which was probably the right way to handle it. Bauer came by in the third week of May with a proposition about shared grazing access to the Eastern Creek section, which Colton negotiated over 2 visits and 3 cups of coffee, and which ended with a handshake and a written agreement that Lillian drafted in proper legal language at the kitchen table. She'd been drafting things in proper legal language for 6 months. Didn't seem worth stopping. The Reyes family sent a note saying they'd received word that the association's water rights challenge on their northern pasture had been dropped, and that they were grateful, and that if there was ever anything they could do in return, they hoped Colton and his wife would let them know. The note addressed her as Mrs. Raines, which she was, which still occasionally surprised her in the way that true things sometimes do when you look at them directly. She was in the yard on a Tuesday in June, hanging laundry in the warm morning air, when the first real pain came. Not panic, she'd known it was coming, had been tracking the signs for days. She stood still for a moment and breathed through it, and then walked inside and found Colton at the table with the livestock records and said, in her best approximation of a calm voice, "I think it's time." He looked up. He went still in the way she'd learned to read, the prior to management stillness, the one before composure was possible. Then he stood up so fast, the chair scraped and said, "I'll get the horse." The midwife, she said, "Mrs. Garza." He said, "Send someone ahead." Right. He was already at the door. He stopped, turned back, looked at her with the expression that was all the complicated things he felt without the words for them, all at once and seemed unguarded. "Go," she said. "I'll be here when you get back." He went. She was not here to tell you that what followed was easy or dignified, or that the frontier made it into something poetic. It was long and painful and exhausting, in the specific total way that nothing else in her life had been exhausting, and Mrs. Garza was a competent and brisk woman who had attended 30-some births in the territory and handled the whole thing with a practical efficiency that Lillian, between the waves of it, genuinely appreciated. Colton paced outside until Mrs. Garza told him firmly to come in and be useful or go away, and he came in and was useful, which was what she'd expected of him. The baby arrived in the early evening, when the light through the bedroom window had gone to the long gold of late afternoon. She was small and loud and had a look of profound offense at the entire situation, which seemed about right. She had dark hair, and she had Colton's eyes, that particular shade that Lillian had spent months looking at across kitchen tables and firelit evenings, and she had already, in the first minutes of her life, a quality of stubbornness in her expression that made Mrs. Garza laugh and say, "This one's going to be trouble." "Good," Lillian said. Her voice came out rough. She didn't care. Colton held his daughter for the first time, with the careful, slightly terrified concentration of a man handling something he didn't want to damage and didn't know the rules for yet. Stood there for a long time, not speaking. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused, evaluating gaze of something brand new trying to make sense of its situation. He looked up at Lillian. His face was she didn't have a word for it. She'd catalogued all his expressions over 7 months, and this one was new. Something entirely undefended. Something that had no habit around it, no practiced management, nothing he'd had to produce for anyone before. "Clara," he said, the name they'd chosen without a great deal of discussion, because it had simply seemed right. She looks like you," Lillian said. He shook his head slowly. "She looks determined," he said. "She looks like she came here to do something. She came here to make us work, Mrs. Garza said, packing her bag, same as all of them. After Mrs. Garza left, in the quiet of the evening with the baby finally sleeping, and the light outside going from gold to gray, Colton sat on the edge of the bed, and Lillian leaned back against the pillow, and they were both too tired to speak, and neither of them needed to. She thought about the physician's letter. She still had it, in the tin box that had replaced the $17 box from Clement Street. She hadn't thrown it out, because it was true when it was written. The physician had said likely, and he'd known what he knew, and what he knew had not encompassed everything. Likely wasn't certainly. Sometimes the body knows things the medicine hasn't caught up to yet. Sometimes the door that seems closed is only almost closed, and something small and determined pushes through anyway. She thought about that, about the things we're told are impossible that turn out to be merely unlikely, about how much of a life is determined by whether you treat those two words as synonyms. The summer settled into work, which was the appropriate response to everything in that territory. The Westfield clearing went on through June and July, Colton doing the heavy work and Lillian managing the planning and the records and the things that could be done from a more stationary position, while Clara slept in the basket beside the kitchen table. By August, they had the section ready for the following spring's expanded grazing. By September, Colton had been in contact with a stock dealer in Cheyenne about additional cattle, and the numbers in the ledger, the ones Lillian kept, with the same methodical attention she'd brought to everything, had moved from survivable to something more than that. Not wealthy, not the kind of comfortable that made problems disappear, but the kind of stable that meant you could look at next year and make plans for it, rather than just hoping to get through it. Tom Bauer came by in August with news about the Ray A's family's water rights being formally restored by the county, which was a downstream effect of the Attorney General's investigation into Voss. The investigation was moving slowly, the way these things moved in territorial courts, but it was moving. Perkins had been removed from his position at the county records office. 2 of Voss's lawyers had declined to continue representing him. The Red Hollow Land and Cattle Association had not formally disbanded, but had ceased all active operations, which was its own kind of ending. Voss himself had moved to Laramie to manage the legal situation closer to the courts. He was not in Red Hollow anymore, which changed the character of the town in ways that were subtle and then less subtle as time went on. People talking more easily at the feed store. The quality of the silences in the saloon different. A general gradual relaxation of a tension that had been so constant, nobody had noticed it until it started to lift. Mrs. Pruitt got her casserole dish back in September, delivered by Colton on a supply run, who reported that she'd inspected it for chips, found none, and said, "Simply tell your wife I'll need this again at Christmas," which was Mrs. Pruitt's way of saying, "You're staying. Part of this now. Welcome to Red Hollow." There is something worth saying about what happened here in this particular story that goes beyond the property lines and the legal filings and the outcome of a county court case. It would be easy to tell this as a story about a woman proving herself coming in as a joke and leaving as a triumph, beating the people who underestimated her at their own game. And that's in it, certainly. But that version misses something important, something that matters more. Lillian didn't win because she was exceptional. She won because she refused to accept other people's definitions of what was possible for her. The physician said likely. The Bureau sent her as a joke. Town bet against her lasting the month. Voss called her situation delicate and thought that was a weapon. Every single one of those people looked at a woman with no property, no family, no formal credentials, and calculated that she was a variable that didn't need to be taken seriously. They were wrong not because she was secretly extraordinary, but because they were looking at the wrong things. They saw what she didn't have. They didn't see what she knew, what she'd learned, what she was willing to do with it. They saw her situation, they didn't see her. There's a lesson in that, and it's not the comfortable one about believing in yourself. It's harder than that. It's about the specific cost of being underestimated, of having to prove, again and again, not just that you can do the thing, but that you are the kind of person who gets to try. Lillian spent 7 months doing work that nobody expected her to do, in conditions nobody had prepared her for, while also building a case, managing a household, forming alliances, and growing a child. She did all of it without the acknowledgement that would have been given automatically to a man in her position. That's not exceptional. That's just what women like her have always done. The exceptional part was that this time it worked. This time the documents held, and the judge was honest, and the people she'd treated with respect chose to reciprocate it. It's not guaranteed. It wasn't guaranteed for Lillian either. It could have gone the other way at a dozen points. Ferris could have been bought. Voss's lawyers could have found a procedural lever she hadn't anticipated. The Perkins letter could have been challenged successfully. It didn't, but it might have. And she would have kept going anyway, because that's what you do when the thing you're fighting for is genuinely yours. Clara was 9 months old when she pulled herself upright for the first time, using the leg of the kitchen table, and stood there swaying and triumphant, and looking at her parents with the profound satisfaction of someone who has accomplished exactly what she set out to do. Lillian was at the table with the ledger. Colton was across from her with the cattle records. They both looked up at the same moment, and the expression on his face, that wide open, undefended thing that had only appeared on the night of Clara's birth, was back. And this time, Lillian let herself feel the full weight of what it meant to have built this. Not easily, not without cost, but genuinely and permanently theirs. There she is, Colton said, soft. Clara let go of the table leg and sat down hard on the floorboards and looked at the situation with the pragmatic assessment of someone who'd fallen down before and had decided that falling was just part of the project. She got back up. Lillian watched her daughter try again, the wobble, the grab for the table, the precarious stand, and thought about all the versions of herself that had gotten back up. After the physician's letter, after the years of managing on $17, after the first week on the ranch when the cold and the work and the silence were nothing like what she'd expected, after the fire and the threats, and Decker at the door, and the night when 4 men came across the dark yard. You got up because there wasn't another option that you could live with. That was the whole of it. Not bravery in the grand storybook sense, just the specific grinding unwillingness to let the version of yourself that gives up be the version that wins. Clara stood again, wobbled, grabbed the table, looked at her parents. She's going to walk today, Colton said. Probably, Lillian said. That'll be the end of peace and quiet around here. We never had much of that anyway. He looked at her over the table, over the ledger, and the cattle records, and the accumulated ordinary debris of a life being actively lived, and he almost smiled. Almost. The almost smile she'd been cataloging since November, the one that kept getting closer. No, he said. We didn't. Years later, when Clara was old enough to ask questions, and young enough to still believe that the people she loved had always been exactly as they were now, she asked her mother about the letter. She'd found it in the tin box, the physician's letter, faded and creased from being folded and folded again over years. What's this? She asked. Lillian looked at it. She hadn't opened the box in a while. She'd forgotten it was there, which was its own kind of progress. It's a letter, she said, from a doctor who knew a lot about medicine. What does it say? It says something was likely. And it was wrong. Clara turned the letter over in her hands, looking at it with the particular focused interest she brought to everything Colton's eyes, her grandmother's curiosity, something that was entirely her own. Was the doctor mean? No, Lillian said. He was just working with what he knew, and what he knew wasn't everything. Clara set the letter down on the table and looked at her mother. What did he not know? Lillian considered the question. There were a dozen ways to answer it. She thought about the stone marker in the creek bed and the Perkins letter folded inside the 1878 document, and the night she'd fired twice into the cold air, and the morning in the kitchen when she'd decided, sitting alone with $17 and an offer she had no reason to accept, to go anyway. He didn't know, she said finally, what I was willing to do. Clara thought about this with the seriousness of someone who was still figuring out what the words meant, but understood they mattered. Oh, she said. and picked up the letter and put it back in the tin box with the careful respect of a child who's been taught that some things are kept because they tell you where you came from. She would ask more questions later, when she was older, about the survey and the court case and the man who'd tried to take the land and what had happened to him. She would learn all of it, piece by piece, the way children learn the history of the places they're from, not as a dramatic story, but as a series of facts gradually assembled into something that explained why the world around her was the shape it was. She would learn that Harlan Voss had eventually faced charges in the territorial court and paid a significant financial penalty, though he'd avoided prison through the combination of good lawyers and declining health. She would learn that the Red Hollow Land and Cattle Association had formally dissolved, and that its lands, the ones acquired through fraud and intimidation, had been subject to review and partial restitution. She would learn that the Hendricks family vault in Cheyenne, Cal at the mill had received formal acknowledgement of what had been done to them, which wasn't the same as getting the land back, but which was something, the official record setting down what had been true all along. She would learn about the women at the boarding house on Clement Street and the $17 in the tin box. She would learn about the physician's letter and what it had meant to her mother to receive it and what it had meant to not let it be the last word. She would grow up on the ranch that her parents had built into something worth building, on land that had been fought for, and documented and proven and held, surrounded by people who'd come through hard things and chosen to stay. She would grow up knowing that belonging to a place is not something given to you at birth, but something you make, with your hands and your decisions, and your willingness to stand in a doorway with a rifle and say no to the thing that is trying to take what is yours. She would grow up, in other words, knowing what her mother had learned, that the most important thing a person can do, in a world full of people who have decided in advance what you're worth, is to refuse to let their calculation be the final one. The ranch stood. That was the simplest way to say it, and after everything, simple felt right. The ranch stood and the land held, and the family in it was imperfect and complicated and real, in the way that only things actually lived can be real. Colton never became a man who found words easy. He remained, to the end of his life, someone who said things to the middle distance, to the land or the fire, who expressed the deepest things sideways, who showed up more reliably than he spoke. But he showed up, every morning, in every season, for every difficult thing the land and the life required. That was who he was. And Lillian had known who he was since the second week, and she had chosen him with her eyes open, and she never had cause to regret the choosing. She never threw away the physician's letter. She kept it in the tin box, and the tin box sat on the shelf in the bedroom, and occasionally she looked at it and thought about what it meant to be told that something in you was broken, not maliciously, not even incorrectly by the standards of what was known, and to go on anyway. Not because you were certain the letter was wrong, but because certainty was never the point. The point was what you did with the likely. Point was whether you let it stop you, or whether you walked to the counter in that tobacco-smelling office and said yes, and got on the stagecoach and went somewhere. You'd never been to build something you'd never had, with a man you'd never met, because manageable was not a future, and you wanted more than manageable. That's the truth of it, underneath all the surveys and affidavits and county court rulings. Not a lesson you can make clean or package tidily. Just the fact of a woman who was handed a life that other people had decided, was already decided, and who looked at it and decided differently. The people who sent her to Red Hollow as a joke never understood what they'd actually done. They thought they were discarding something. They were wrong about that. The way people are often wrong when they mistake a woman's constraints for her limits. They sent her out there to fail quietly. She built something instead. And the land, finally, honestly, legally, was home.